Chapter 1251 Rude Awakening. With nightmare guarding Sunny's dreams, his sleep was deep and peaceful. His awakening, however, was not. What? Sunny woke from feeling the world tilt, and then quake with a violent shudder. He was thrown sideways and collided with the slope of the fissure, feeling the sharp rocks cutting into his skin. Groggy and disoriented, he tried to stand up, but got tangled in the sleeping bag instead. Damn it! The sleeping bag disintegrated as he tore through it, already summoning the sin of solace and the moonlight shard. The world lurched once again, and the deafening roar of water reached his ear. What is going on? Assessing his surroundings through shadow sense, Sunny did not notice immediate danger. He did, however, notice Nephi's. She had climbed out of the fissure and was now standing on its edge, her white tunic and silver hair fluttering in the wind. Sunny could not see her face, but judging by the lack of weapons in her hands, the situation was not critical. He let out a relieved sigh, then glanced at the destroyed sleeping bag with regret. Just a moment later, the dark island shuddered again, and a strange tremor ran through the black turtle's stone shell. Follow current novels on NOV/3LB, in co/M. At that moment, an obnoxious voice resounded from his left. Good morning. Rise and shine. Throwing a contemptuous glance at the spirit of the sin of solace, Sunny grimaced and pushed himself off the ground. Soaring high into the air, he kicked the slope of the fissure and propelled himself even higher, landing noiselessly near Nephi a moment later. The 7 suns were already rising, and the world was suffused with the golden radiance of dawn. What is happening? Instead of answering, she pointed her finger at a particular spot off the edge of the island. There, the water was turbulent and foamy, rising in violent waves. The river had washed away most of the blood during the night, but now, it was painted red once again. In fact, the red color was more vivid and intense than ever. Sunny frowned. The next moment, something large and swift moved beneath the surface of the red water, and the carcass of the black turtle quaked again. What the? My first nightmare? An awakened tyrant appears. The solstice? There's a fallen terror blocking the only way out. The second nightmare? Here is a couple of immortal saints I need to kill, oh, and they are completely out of their minds. Really, I went through so many absolutely unreasonable things as an aspirant, sleeper, and awakened. Sunny rolled his eyes. I am a master now, and instead of fighting fallen nightmare creatures like masters are supposed to do, there's this great beast staring me down. Let's not even mention all the corrupted abominations I've already killed. Is this what they call suffering from success? If so, I really don't want to be such an overachiever anymore. Can't something normal happen, for once? Listening to him, Nephi's tilted her head a little. She remained silent for a bit, and then said, You're right. You really had to overcome completely unreasonable things as an aspirant, sleeper, awakened, and master. Then, a hint of a smile appeared on her lips, and sparks of white light ignited in her eyes. But, Sunny, considering all that, have you thought about what kind of things you'll have to face as a saint? Sunny's already pale face suddenly became even whiter. A hint of horror appeared in his eyes. Oh, gods. He shivered. You evil, no, I don't want to even think about it. Smiling, Nephi looked away and concentrated on the Azure Serpent once again. After a few moments of silence, she said, Maybe you should consider this as training, then. In any case, what do you think we should do now? Sunny threw a gloomy glance her way and shrugged. I'm not sure. The turtle is huge, so even this old snake won't be able to hollow its shell out quickly. I don't think it can overturn the carcass or break through the carapace at this point, but I'm not sure. We should be ready for anything, I guess. Nephi lingered for a while and then nodded. I agree. Let's wait and see, then. As the enormous carcass of the great monster shuddered once again, they stood side by side and watched silently as the water was slowly saturated with crimson blood. Chapter 1252 Voyage. At first, Sunny and Nephi were tense and fully focused, observing the feasting serpent with grim apprehension and a bit of dread. But then, slowly, it got a little boring. Even though very few people had ever gotten a chance to see a great beast devour a great monster, or maybe none at all, as it turned out, even such a macabre and awesome spectacle could grow old really fast. The black turtle was just too enormous. Even though the Azure serpent was gigantic itself, it still couldn't devour a significant portion of its carcass in a short amount of time, no matter how hard it tried. It would probably take the creature days, or even weeks, to put a dent in the floating corpse of the titanic monster. Eventually, Sunny and Nephi found themselves sitting side by side on the green moss, looking silently at the great river. The two of them made for a striking contrast. Sunny was wearing a tunic of black silk embroidered with silver thread, his hair black as a raven's wing. Nephi was wearing a tunic, too, hers perfectly white and decorated with red accents. Her long silver hair was moving slightly in the wind. One's eyes were like two pools of unfathomable darkness, the others were gray, calm, and hid within them a boundless, immolating heat. Both would have seemed too flawless and beautiful to a mundane human, with perfectly smooth alabaster skin and faces that seemed to have been chiseled from precious stone by a divine sculptor. Surrounded by the vast expanse of a mystical river and sitting calmly atop the shell of a great monster, wearing no armor and holding no weapons in their hands, they looked like two transient deities that had descended from the heavenly realm to rest on the soft moss and enjoy the breathtaking beauty of this strange world. Of course, Sunny had none of these thoughts. Instead, he had an entirely different view of the current situation. Over the years, he had grown accustomed to being in the company of armor-clad awakened, heavily armed soldiers, and military vehicles. Looking at the slender silhouette of Nephi's body outlined by the light fabric of her tunic, and the weightless silk of his own graceless dusk, he couldn't help but feel a sense of strange incongruity. They were currently in the most dire predicament of their habitually dire lives. And yet, what the hell? We look like we're enjoying a luxury cruise, visit for the best novel reading experience. Of course, leisure cruises and getaways on tropical islands had not been a thing since before the dark times. Sunny just found the idea amusing after randomly learning about that ancient tradition from Rain, and was reminded of that conversation right now. He knew that being surrounded by great abominations was not exactly one's idea of a relaxing vacation. However, the corpse of the black turtle was technically floating, so it was like a ship. At the same time, it was large enough to be an island. The food was delicious. The view was to die for. Sunny looked at her carefully. A strange thought surfaced in his mind. Was she going to say something else? He suddenly felt tense again. A lot of very complicated emotions that Sunny had done his best to avoid for a long time reared their heads in his heart. Was she? Luckily, or unfortunately, the Azure Serpent chose that exact moment to let out a frenzied roar and dive back into the water, sending a huge fountain of it flying into the sky. It seemed that the old snake had been satiated, by now. Full of renewed vigor, the serpent started circling the black turtle once again, raising its head from time to stare at them with deranged eyes. Sunny sighed. This snake just never gives up, does it? Nephi silently nodded and then stood up. Illuminated by the light of the 7 suns and outlined against the blue sky, her lithe figure was like a painting. But it really can't overturn the carcass or break the shell. We don't need to keep watching it for now. Sunny raised an eyebrow. So then, what should we do? She thought for a while, then glanced at the soft carpet of green moss and the mysterious landscape of the dark island. Eventually, Nephi shrugged. Whatever we want. Chapter 1253 Parade of Shadows. After resting for a while, Sunny and Nephi separated. She went off to study the memories Sir Gilead had transferred to her. There had not been a lot of time to get a proper feel for them in the Nightmare Desert. Sunny, meanwhile, remained sitting on the soft moss with a contemplative expression. Follow current novels on NOV/3LB, in co/m. What to do? First, he closed his eyes and sent the 5 shadows to investigate the dark island. It was somewhere between 1 and 2 kilometers across, so there was not a lot of ground to cover. However, the terrain of the giant shell of black rock was weathered and uneven. There were plenty of cracks and fissures, some of them large and easy to notice, others hidden from view. Some were entirely filled with water. The exploration did not take too long. His shadows did not find anything really interesting, either. There was the weathered rock, the vibrant patches of green moss, and the remains of the creature's battle armor, its silver now tarnished and bleak. Other than that, the dark island was desolate and barren. What made a deep impression on Sunny, though, were the fissures themselves. At first, he had assumed that they were just natural features of the great monster's stone shell, but after some time, with a shiver, he realized that they were not. Instead, each of the deep grooves was a scar left on the titanic shell of the ancient creature by unknown enemies. None managed to penetrate it, and some were rather shallow, however, some were dark and frighteningly deep. Considering that even the Azure Serpent was not able to crack the black turtle's carapace, Sunny dreaded to imagine what kind of creatures had left those claw marks on its back. He looked at the gleaming expanse of the great river with gloom. Suddenly, the enchanting beauty of this dreamlike world seemed like a facade that hid unspeakable horrors behind its alluring veil. Of course, Sunny had known that already. But in that moment, he felt it stronger than ever before. Beautiful things are the most dangerous. Glancing in the direction where Nephi's had left, he sighed and stretched his legs. The shadows returned, and then, 3 figures rose from them. Onyx Saint, Nightmare, and Ravenous Fiend. He silently studied them for a while, thinking. Saint was stoic and indifferent, as always. If he did not know that she was alive, he would have assumed that the graceful and towering figure in front of him was a beautiful statue. Nightmare was staring at the Azure Serpent, which was circling the island, with dark and malevolent fury burning in his crimson eyes. Imp seemed a little uncomfortable under Sunny's gaze, shifting from foot to foot nervously. 1 year? If so, then the augmentation of the stifled scream could potentially reach its theoretical limit in no time. That was an outlandish theory, but it was worth checking out, at least. Satisfied, Sunny turned to Imp. On paper, the scrawny goblin was on the same level of power as Saint. He was a transcendent devil, as well. But in reality, there was an insurmountable gap between them. Imp was just an adolescent as far as shadows went, after all. He was still on the weaker side, inexperienced and untrained. His core physical attribute, the lesser steel body, had just recently evolved to the greater steel body. Sunny had thought that it would be extremely hard to locate large quantities of metal of higher quality than the body of Sun Prince. But, as it turned out, he was wrong. They were currently on top of the black turtle's titanic corpse, and that corpse was encased in the remains of similarly titanic battle armor. Surely, the armor deserving of a great monster would be made of some truly incredible stuff? Looking at the nervous Imp, Sunny grinned and pointed to the nearest jagged chunk of tarnished silver. Go, buddy. Gorge yourself. Bon appetit. The scrawny goblin tentatively turned to look in the direction he was pointing. A few moments later, its eyes dramatically widened. I bet it's going to be a bit tough to chew, be you? Before Sunny could finish speaking, Imp was already dashing toward the band of ancient silver with a maddened expression. He chuckled. I guess it smells delicious. Chapter 1254. Back to Basics. With Saint standing guard, Nightmare keeping her company, and Imp happily munching on the tarnished silver of the great monster's battle armor, Sunny was once again left with nothing much to do. The 7 suns were shining in the 3-colored sky. The clear waters of the great river were flowing as they sparkled in the sunlight. The Azure Serpent was hungrily circling the dark island, ramming it from time to time to make its wrathful madness known. The sin of Solace was brooding silently. A gentle breeze was playing with Sunny's hair. With a sigh, he swept it back and rose, planning to go find Nephi's visit for the best novel reading experience. This is too weird. He had expected many situations to arise at the start of the 3rd nightmare, but one thing he had not expected was being left with nothing urgent to do. Walking across the weathered surface of the black rock, Sunny went around a torn band of dull silver, traversed a few patches of moss, and finally laid his eye on Nephi's. She was training. Holding an unfamiliar longsword, Nephi was practicing a complicated chain of moves, her silver hair dancing in the air. There were beads of sweat on her face, and the hem of the airy tunic was flaring, revealing smooth porcelain skin. Her movements were limber and flowing, gracefully cascading into each other. The sight of it was beautiful. Neff's swordsmanship was beautiful. And she was beautiful, too. Illuminated by the dreamlike radiance of the 7 suns and dancing with a silvery sword on a carpet of green moss, with her white tunic and alabaster skin, she was like a fairy. Sunny found himself standing motionlessly in the shadow of a rock outcropping, watching. He had been planning to call out to Nephi, but now, forgetting about it, he silently remained where he was. Some time passed. Sunny wasn't sure how much exactly. The island trembled once more. Eventually, he shifted slightly, as though escaping a reverie, and took a step forward to escape the shadows. Hey! Nephi stopped and leaned on her sword, breathing heavily. Her chest was rising and falling, and her face was slightly flushed. Walking over, Sunny summoned the endless spring and offered it to her with a friendly smile. Accepting the beautiful glass bottle, she sat down and wiped the sweat off her face, then threw her head back and drank greedily. Sunny glanced at her slender neck and the beads of sweat glistening above the collar of her tunic, which was slightly damp and sticking a little to her body. Then, he looked away. Thank you. After drinking her fill, Nephi returned the endless spring to Sunny. He hesitated for a moment, then drank some of the cool, refreshing water himself and sat down near her. He had completely forgotten what he was going to say. After a moment or two of peaceful silence, Sunny finally remembered. Her eyes glinted. But I've never been an awakened. I went straight to being a master. So, learning to control essence was very hard for me. I had to be conscious of every muscle in my body, every tendon, and every bone. It was like learning to walk again. A corner of Sunny's mouth twitched as he suppressed a smile. He vividly remembered helping her pass these exact obstacles. Nephi, meanwhile, continued. So, I had to go back to basics. Which groups of muscles do I need to enhance to perform the cut in the most efficient and effective way? My hand, my shoulder, my back, my core, my thighs, my calves, everything had to work in harmony to produce the best result. It took a while to become proficient enough in controlling essence to do it right without thinking. And, in the process, I became much more aware of my body. I also got submerged in studying the basics, on a much deeper level than before. Going deeper and deeper. Sunny looked at her with curiosity. How deep are we talking about? She smiled, lingered for a moment, and then said. Force equals mass times acceleration. He blinked. What? What? Sunny had not expected to hear a physics formula. And he only knew that this was a physics formula because teacher Julius had once thrown a tantrum about his lack of education and forced him to read a bunch of children's school books. Nephi smiled. That is the basis of swordsmanship or spearmanship, or any other kind of weapon skill. Fundamentally, it's all about delivering force. The amount of force is dependent on mass and acceleration. Your body is the source of that force, and your weapon is a force multiplier that concentrates it into a narrow tip, thus making it easier to deliver lethal damage. She pointed to the sharp tip of her sword. Of course, there are more nuances to that. For example, speed does not exist in a vacuum, it is relative to the enemy. Your body also has to borrow from the ground you are standing on. There is balance, centers of gravity, reaction speed. As for the sword itself, there is flexibility, material composition, center of percussion, and so on. There is also soul essence, memory enchantments, attributes, and aspect abilities to consider. Sunny was looking at her incredulously, which caused Nephi to shrug in embarrassment. Well, anyway. I've been studying the fundamentals, physics, anatomy, spell studies, and a bit of other stuff a lot since returning from the second nightmare. And slowly incorporating these insights into my swordsmanship. Something like that. He tilted his head, a bit dumbfounded. That can't be right. How have we gone from the essence of combat is murder to force equals acceleration? So, Nephi's had been studying science, to shore up her fundamentals and evolve her swordsmanship? That sounded very strange. But the result was apparent, she had clearly improved by leaps and bounds since her ascension. Sunny shook his head in disbelief, and then threw a pointed look at her. His voice was incredulous. Care for a spar? Chapter 1255 Dancing Spirits. With a faint smile on her face, Nephi nodded and raised her sword, pointing it at him in invitation. Sunny summoned the Sin of Solace and took a stance opposite her. From the forgotten shore to the basement of his home in the peaceful terrace district, they had trained with each other numerous times. This simple sequence of actions was as natural for them as breathing. However, today, there was an awkward pause. Sunny scratched the back of his head and glanced at the Jade Jian. That isn't going to work, is it? Nephi seemed to have come to a similar conclusion, looking at him sheepishly. No, what the hell, since when does she know how to emote? This is just too cute. He coughed. The problem facing them was that both had grown too powerful, and, subsequently, the weapons they used were too powerful, too. The Sin of Solace was a transcendent memory of the 5th tier, and quite a harrowing one at that. Sunny was not entirely sure what the level of Nef's longsword was, but it had to be quite a menacing weapon, as well, considering that it had come from the sole arsenal of a saint. It would be already bad enough if the Sin of Solace damaged or destroyed it. But what if Sunny was not careful enough and scratched Nephi in the process? The curse of madness carried by the Jade Blade would either crush her mental defenses, or at least put debilitating pressure on her mind for a period of time. Standing some distance away, the spirit of the Jian smiled. No. Don't worry. I'll be gentle. However, that smile of his was more than a little bit sinister. Sunny frowned, then dismissed the jade sword and got lost in thought for a few moments. Eventually, a smile of delight appeared on his lips. Let's do this. The shadows around them suddenly moved and flowed toward him, then slowly formed into 2 inky black swords. One of them was a fearsome odachi, while the other was an elegant longsword. The odachi was easy to create, this was one of the shapes Sunny had practiced relentlessly, after all. The longsword was a little bit tricky, since he had never created one before. Nevertheless, he was familiar with it as well, and so managed to produce a passable one with some effort. No. He was drowning in her flowing sword. How is she so different? It was not as though Sunny did not understand the same principles Nef had spoken about. The relationship between mass, acceleration, and force, he was intimately familiar with it, as well. After all, Sunny had long incorporated the ability to change his weight at will into his battle skill, so much so that it had become second nature to him. By manipulating how much his body, or various parts of it, weighed on the fly, he was able to enhance the force of his attacks, secure his balance, and even perform seemingly impossible moves by shifting his center of gravity. By now, it was like an instinct. He knew a lot about anatomy, too, both from his own training after the ascension, mastery of shadow dance, and learning how to create shadow hands. Everything that Nephi had mentioned, Sunny studied too. However, as they thought, he understood the difference between them. It was the difference between an intuitive, instinctual knowledge and a comprehensive, systemic understanding. And so, even though Sunny could perceive the essence of what Nephi was doing through shadow dance, he couldn't repeat it with the same level of insight. This was different from fighting Morgan. Morgan was supremely skilled, yes, but the main challenge of dueling her was the dire power of her enchanted body and her sharp, killing will. Nephi was not using any augmentations, and her will was vast and calm as an ocean. Beneath that indomitable calmness hid the fiery fury of a roaring flame. It was pure technique, pure insight, pure mastery. Pure passion. Sunny frowned, feeling that he, too, was starting to sweat. Nephi was strong, but he was strong too. Among human swordsmen, he was perhaps one of the strongest. His mind was clear, his elusive skill was perilously insidious. He was not the same person he had been before. Antarctica had forged him into someone much more steady, powerful, and deadly. Their duel was exhilarating. Chapter 1256 Reaching for the Stars Plus, Turn Off Reset. Chapter 1256 Reaching for the Stars. Sunny and Nephi's climbed back into the familiar fissure only after the seven suns plunged into the waters of the great river. They hungrily consumed the last few ration packs from the covetous coffer, and then settled on the weathered rock to sleep. Saint was standing guard above the fissure, and Nightmare was near to protect their dreams. So, they decided not to alternate and let themselves rest through the whole night. The world was swiftly enveloped in darkness. The nocturnal glow of the great river did not reach the depths of the fissure, and there were no stars or the moon in the sky. The world was entirely black, as if they had plunged into an endless void. Listening to the soft sounds of Nef's breath, Sunny let the sense of fatigue overwhelm him. He was tired. However, it was not the cruel, chilling exhaustion he had suffered often in the past months. Instead, this fatigue was of a satisfying and pleasurable kind. Something he had not felt in a while. Sunny had learned a lot during their training today. They had practiced together until the sunset, and in the process, both had done their best to make the opponent sweat. He had not held back much, and neither had Nephi's. In the end, Sunny found himself lacking. Even after all this time, she was still like a distant star, one he could see, but never touch. At least in terms of swordsmanship and mastery of battle. It should have been disheartening, but he found it strangely encouraging instead. Sunny felt as though he had been shown a new horizon, something to strive for, as well as a clear direction to reach for the stars. He also realized that there were still flaws in his mastery of shadow dance. That was a valuable revelation in and of itself. Armed with it, he could refine and perfect his formless style, bringing it closer to the next step. That said, Sunny felt very strange right now. It was because he had realized that, currently, he was more powerful than Nephi's. Yes, she was a better fighter than him. However, Sunny had so many tools at his disposal. He also had two transcendent devils and an awakened terror on his side. If the two of them were to battle seriously, he wasn't entirely sure who would be left standing at the end, but he knew that his odds were much higher than hers. It was a vast, tumultuous, and deeply unsettling emotion. What surprised him the most, however, was how weak of a reaction it aroused in him. There had been a time when becoming more powerful than Nephi's was all he ever thought about. But now, he felt almost indifferent. It was what it was. There was no point in racing to the finish line, anyway. That line would not change. It did not matter which one of them became a terror first, because sooner or later, both of them would end up as titans. It did not matter that Sunny was ahead for the first time. Her ascended ability was not of a kind that added to one's power, that was all. They were in the same boat, anyway. Perhaps he could allow himself to feel that way because he was more secure about the shadow bond, and the power she held over him. Nephi's had proven that she had no intention of ever using it, and he had grown more confident in his ability to make one or both of them die even if she did. How romantic. He sighed, feeling calm and cozy in the darkness that enveloped them. After a while, Sunny asked, "Hey, Nef, are you asleep yet?" There were few moments of silence before she answered. He stared at Nephi's incredulously for a few moments, then laid down and looked back at the jagged line of the distant black sky. A moment or two later, he suddenly laughed, too. This is just too ridiculous." Nephi's lowered her hand, then asked in an amused tone. "What is?" Sunny shrugged. "I mean, we are sailing a river of an unholy titan's blood on the corpse of a great monster. Moving back in time. And giggling like children." She remained silent for a while before saying in her usual calm tone, "Yes. It does sound a little ridiculous." Then, there was a comfortable silence between them. Sunny looked at the black sky for a while. Soon, a sigh escaped from his lips. He lingered for a long time, then turned his head to look at her again. "Nef? Can I ask you something?" She turned her head to face him, as well, even though she couldn't see anything in the dark. Sure. Sunny hesitated. But, eventually, he still asked. Can you tell me what happened to you in the second nightmare? A hint of amusement slowly disappeared from her eyes. Her faint smile was erased, as well. Nephi's remained silent for a long time, her expression turning bleak and distant. Then, she sighed. Okay. I'll tell you. Her voice sounded strangely forlorn. Turning away, Nephi looked into the darkness and said. In my second nightmare, I was a woman made of stone. Like your shadow, but also different, defective. Chapter 1257 In the Darkness. Nephi looked into the darkness as she spoke in an even voice. It happened after the demon of destiny had his falling out with the goddess of the black skies. I think. But before hope escaped her chains, and the demons rose in rebellion against the gods. In the darkness, in the true darkness that fills the halls and caverns of the underworld. Below the hollow mountains. She sighed. When I opened my eyes, I was a woman made of stone. A crude, clumsy, and defective precursor of the stone saints. I was laying on a mountain of abandoned statues just like me, all of them broken, discarded, and forsaken. Everything around me was enveloped by cold darkness, with not a spark of light or hint of warmth anywhere. There was just me, my broken siblings, and the lonesome silence. Sunny shifted slightly. True darkness? Nephi slowly nodded. Yes, those mountains are called hollow, but in fact, they are full of darkness. Their hollows are like great reservoirs of it, it is where darkness lives, and where it comes from. True darkness is very much like this river, in fact. Legends say that a terrible creature was slain by the gods once, at the dawn of time, and that its blood seeped into the earth. This is what true darkness is, the dark creature's blood. Sunny shivered. That dark creature, to be the source of all true darkness, of the entire element of darkness, it had to be something far greater than an unholy titan. It must have been one of the unknown, then. A being of the void. Ignorant of what he was thinking about, Nephi continued after a short pause. The hollow mountains are a scar left by the death of that creature. And so, most of true darkness remains below them. This is the place that Nether made his home. However, it was not entirely empty. While he ruled the underworld, there were many others living in the darkness. I was just a sleeper, after all. Even with the echo I gained in the nightmare desert, out there in the darkness, my strength was pitiful. Ah, it was such a blow. I never realized how much pride I took in being strong before that nightmare. I had always relied on my strength. I had always told myself that I had to be strong. If only I was strong like my father, if only I was strong, stronger, the strongest, then I wouldn't break apart. And the people around me wouldn't need to suffer on my behalf either. Sunny remained silent, remembering Nef's nightmare that he had visited after she returned to the waking world. He also thought about his own desperate pursuit of strength. Nephi smiled. But in the nightmare, all my strength was worthless. All my pride was worthless, too. All I had was weakness, and so, I had to learn that personal power was not something I should rely on, or could rely on. It had always seemed so important, but in the end, it turned out to be a deceitful mirage. A slight frown appeared on her face. You see, there were not only the outcasts and discarded creatures like me in the darkness at the roots of the underworld. There were other things, as well, terrifying things that were born from the darkness. These things hunted us. There were ancient horrors dwelling in the very depths of the abyss, as well. Sometimes, they would crawl from below to devour us. No one in the underworld cared about what happened to us, if they even remembered our existence. The aloof demon of destiny, the first generation of the stone saints, and the remains of the demon's soldiers, none would protect us. The Forsaken had to fend for themselves. But we were weak, and pitiful. And, most of all, we were divided. Her voice shook a little. Sunny lingered for a few moments, then asked carefully. So, what did you do? How did you survive? Nephi took a deep breath. I had to accept my weakness, and learn how to survive despite being weak. The lesson was harsh, demeaning, and painful. But I had no choice but to learn it. So, I coaxed, persuaded, deceived, enticed, and cajoled the other forsaken creatures living in the darkness. But, most of all, I inspired them. You see, I realized that there was something much sharper than my wit, much more persuasive than my words, and much more compelling than my lies. She paused for a moment. That something was desire. Chapter 1258 Last Light. Hidden in the darkness, Sunny flinched. The image of the piece of wet wood littered with demented runes suddenly appeared in his mind, as did the word repeating in the runes over and over again. Wish, desire. Be careful of what you wish for. Be careful what you desire. He frowned while Nephi's continued somberly. All I had to do was instill a desire in the Forsaken. A desire for a better life, longer life, safer life. A yearning for things that they had either never known or long forgotten, comfort, companionship, warmth. I had to give them hope. Because we couldn't survive alone, but we could survive together. Most of these creatures were solitary and numb, resigned to their dark existence. The weight of their hopelessness and despair was too great for me to pull them from it. But, by igniting a yearning in their hearts, I could make them push themselves forward with their own strength. She grew silent once again, and remained so for a long time this time. When Nephi spoke again, her voice was almost a whisper. We gathered together, and built a village. It had tall walls and stone houses. It even had a large hall for us to gather and enjoy each other's company. And, for a while, life was good. United, we could protect ourselves from the creatures of darkness, and hide from the abyssal visitors behind the tall walls. I thought that I was on the right track. There were old creatures in the village that taught me their knowledge and wisdom. There were those who had been warriors once. I learned from them, as well. I was the weakest one, but I was liked and valued. Because I could create light, which all of them had forgotten. White sparks ignited in her eyes before trembling and disappearing. Neff's face grew motionless. But then, someone in the village vanished. And then, someone else. At first, I thought that they had left. But after the third one was gone, the fourth, the fifth, we all realized that something was wrong. They didn't leave. They were taken. After that, every night, what served as night in the underworld, someone would disappear. We were under attack. She paused. We tried everything in our power to find and confront the creature that was killing the villagers. We enhanced our defenses, increased our vigilance. We investigated, we explored the surrounding darkness for clues. We set traps, carved sorceress runes into the stone, and placed lures. We even sent an envoy to plead for help from the children of Nether. But nothing worked. Neff's voice was growing dull. The appraisal. Do you remember how the spell appraised your performance? Nephi shook her head. I was pretty out of it there at the end. I remember standing in the middle of the empty hall. And the next thing I remember was you calling me by my true name at the academy. Sunny sighed, then leaned forward and lightly patted her on the shoulder. Well, if it means anything. I think you did well. You did really well, Neff. He felt her body tremble slightly, and then took the endless spring from her fingers. Thank you for telling me. Now, let's sleep. He lingered for a moment, and then added lightly. Please be careful with the sleeping bag, though. Don't rip it. It's really expensive. She nodded, then smiled faintly and lay down, turning away. Sunny looked at Neff's back for a few moments, then silently returned to his own sleeping spot and sprawled on the weathered rock. He stared at the black sky for a few moments before closing his eyes. Would I have survived that nightmare? Sunny really did not know. He could also tell that Nephi's had brushed past many perilous fights and dire torments that she must have endured there, in the darkness. All alone. His heart was heavy, but before too long, the exhaustion won, sending him into the embrace of sleep. Chapter 1259 Pristine Soul. In the morning, the island shook again. Sunny opened his eyes and reached through the shadow sense, checking in on Saint. Since the taciturn knight was standing calmly above the fissure, he relaxed and yawned with great satisfaction. He felt incredibly refreshed. The dark island was in one piece, and nothing was pouncing to kill them. Life was great. He sat up, leaned on the slope of the fissure, then rubbed his eyes and looked around. Nephice was already up, doing light stretches a few meters away. Sunny watched her for a few moments, then forced himself to avert his gaze. The sound of her even, yet fragile voice resounding from the darkness still echoed in his ears. Neff's second nightmare was different from his own, just like her first nightmare had been. She had not battled immortal saints to free an imprisoned demon from divine chains. Instead, she had tried to save a small group of pitiful and forlorn creatures, only to watch them all die. Nephice had been the last one standing on the forgotten shore, and after traveling alone through the purgatory of the nightmare desert, she built a tiny community amidst the cold darkness, only to watch it be destroyed. She had been so strong, but the nightmare made her weak. She had been so proud, but the nightmare made her beg for mercy on her knees. He wasn't sure he could imagine how painful it was for her, to sacrifice the two things that were at the core of her sense of self. Yes, Neff had not slain impossibly powerful enemies with her radiant sword in the nightmare, but, for her, wielding a sword against an overwhelming foe was not something to be feared. Maybe that was why the spell always tried to break her in some other, more cruel way. Sunny looked down at the weathered surface of the black rock. The spell. I wonder. How had the spell appraised Neff's performance in the second nightmare? Sunny was not sure, but he had an inkling that the appraisal was exceedingly high. If his theory was right, that was, and the appraisal depended on how much the challenger had changed the flow of fate. In that regard, he suspected that what Nephice had done was miraculous. She had wanted to change the fates of the forsaken creatures living in the darkness at the bottom of the underworld. In that task, she failed. Visit for the best novel reading experience. However, she had succeeded in changing something else. She changed the harrowing creature that had come from the darkness. Had the creature been compelled by her words? By her pleas? Just what was Nephice, exactly? And, more importantly, what was she to him? The subject of his thoughts, meanwhile, finished her stretching exercises, pulled the fastened strap of her white tunic back to her pale shoulder, and looked around. Nephice smiled. You're up? Sunny smiled back. Yeah. How are you feeling? It seemed as though she had recovered from opening the old wounds to tell him about her second nightmare yesterday. However, a moment later, Neff's smiling face darkened a little. She sighed. I wanted to make breakfast. But, we have no food left. Sunny tilted his head, then looked down. They were literally sitting on a mountain of meat. But with the Azure Serpent circling the carcass of the black turtle, diving into the river to procure even a little bit of it was an utterly lethal task. He shook his head with resignation. We'll solve that problem when the time comes. Nephice nodded, lingered for a moment, then pointed to the sleeping bag. See? I didn't rip it. Sunny stared at her, trying to determine whether she was being serious or playing a joke on him. These days, it was getting hard to tell. Which bastard is being such a bad influence on my straight-laced and awkward Neff? I'm going to bash their teeth in. He remained silent for a few moments, then grinned. Good. Because, you still owe me for that projector. Chapter 1260 Leisure Cruise. Time flowed lazily. Both literally and figuratively. The current of the great river was pulling the corpse of the black turtle into the past, and several days passed in a strange, but pleasant idleness. The 7 suns rose and fell, drowning in the shimmering waters. The sky was like a dreamlike painting of lilac, azure, crimson, and jet black. The ancient serpent continued to circle the dark island, slowly consuming the bleeding meat of the great monster it had killed, and watching Sunny and Nephice enjoy their unexpected respite. The two of them were spending their time leisurely. Feeling the need to rest and recuperate after the nightmarish gauntlet of the White Desert, they were not in a hurry to strain themselves too much. They slept peacefully through the nights, rising when warm sunlight flowed into the narrow fissure, and spent most of the days together. Sometimes, they would lay on the soft moss side by side and look at the sky in comfortable silence. Sometimes, they would train, sparring with each other until sweat covered their bodies. Sometimes, they would talk, discussing their experiences in the past year and various pieces of knowledge they had picked up along the way. They also spent some time apart. Nephice was busy practicing her swordsmanship, often requesting Saint to aid her as a training partner. After sending her and his shadow off, Sunny would get busy with his own endeavors. He spent a lot of time studying the strange and hauntingly complex weave of the key of the estuary. This memory was a great mystery that had to be solved. Even after showing it to Nephice, Sunny had not a single inkling of what it was supposed to do, and where it had come from. Updated from. So, he settled for the slow approach of meticulously examining each and every thread of its somber tapestry. Depending on luck, this task could take him many months to complete, but there was no harm in starting early. Once his head started to ache from studying the black weave, Sunny would sit silently near the slopes of the island and watch the Azure Serpent prowl. He would close his eyes and sense the great beast's shadow. He would try to memorize its every scale, scar, and movement. Sunny was sitting on a luxurious wooden chair, which was positioned near the slopes of the black turtle's carapace, facing north. His shadow surrounded him, lazily sprawled on the black rocks and enjoying the dreamlike vista of the great river. Only the naughty one had wandered off to enjoy the view of Nephi's training instead. Dismissing the estuary key, Sunny rubbed his temples and stretched his legs. I don't get it. I just don't get it. I don't recognize any of these weave elements. Not even their vague purpose. The more I look at it, the more sure I am that it won't be created by me. Whoever had created the key of the estuary was a far greater sorcerer than Sunny was, or could ever dream to be. At least that was how it seemed. Alright, that's enough for today. The old snake should be showing its ugly mug any minute now. I really hope that it's as tired of staring at me as I am tired of staring at it. Sunny glanced at the wide patch of bloody water surrounding the shell of the great turtle in anticipation, lingered for a few moments, and then frowned. Something was wrong with that picture. He stared at the water for a while, his scowl deepening. Then, Sunny slowly raised his eyes and looked at the sky. His pupils widened slightly. There, in the boundless blue expanse, far away, a black dot had appeared at some point. Chapter 1261 A Butterfly Flapping Its Wings Plus, Turn Off Reset. Chapter 1261 A Butterfly Flapping Its Wings. There was a black dot in the sky, far in the distance, slowly moving in the direction of the dark island. At first, Sunny felt a glimmer of hope ignite in his heart as he remembered a similar situation from the past. That time it had turned out to be Kai. But, this time, his intuition was ringing alarm bells, and a cold feeling of dread crept from somewhere to grip him with icy claws. Sitting on the shadow chair with his legs crossed, Sunny leaned back and sighed. Crap. With that, he exploded with a flurry of activity. First, Sunny dismissed his precious chair and dashed toward the middle of the island. At the same time, he sent a mental command to Saint. Nephice and she were currently engaged in a furious sword fight. Light and darkness were intertwined in a shimmering whirlpool of sharp steel, and the graceful knight's onyx figure was starkly contrasted against the rippling white tunic and alabaster skin of her slender opponent. Following Sunny's order, Saint froze. The tip of Neph's sword stopped a split second later, hovering millimeters away from the slit of her visor. Nephice frowned, then retracted her sword and looked around. There was a shadow on a rock outcropping that protruded from the ground a few meters away. It seemed to belong to a young man, and was currently waving its arms in the air while pointing at the sky. She swiftly turned around and looked up, then dashed away a moment later. That's done. Running as fast as he could, Sunny leaped over a murky puddle of water and landed near a half-eaten fragment of tarnished silver. The scrawny figure of Imp could be seen nearby, laying on the ground with a blissful smile on his fiendish face. His hands were rubbing his ballooning belly with delight. "Stand up, buddy." The gluttonous goblin opened his eyes and stared at Sunny in confusion, then awkwardly tried to rise to his feet. However, outweighed by his full stomach, imp-lost Sunny leaned down, grabbed the weakly struggling fiend, and hoisted him on his shoulder. His balance and promptly plopped back down. "It's a butterfly." Indeed, a butterfly was descending toward the island. From afar, it seemed like an ethereal and beautiful creature. But as it drew closer, Sunny couldn't help but shiver. The butterfly's wings and back were black, but its body and underbelly were the color of white bone. It had 6 long, seemingly fragile legs that ended in sharp points, and 2 enormous, faceted eyes that were like orbs of pure darkness. Between them was a disturbingly long, oily black beak, which was currently bent into a spiral like an elephant's trunk. 2 antennae rose from its head, pushed back by the current of the wind. Apart from that, the butterfly was at least 100 meters in size. It was both exquisitely beautiful and deeply revolting. But, most of all, it was deeply frightening. Sunny gritted his teeth. "It's another great monster." His heart was beating rapidly in his chest, and his back was covered with cold sweat. "Great. This is just great." "Great, ha, it literally is." By his side, Nephi scowled. "What about?" The monstrous butterfly was obviously intending to land on the island, but at that moment, the crimson water parted, and the Azure Serpent's scaled snout rose into the air. Pierced by a mad gaze of its cloudy eyes, the great monster suddenly seemed wary. It moved its wings and altered the direction of its flight, circling the corpse of the black turtle from above instead of diving down to land on the black rock. The butterfly's huge eyes were aimed at the ancient serpent, and its antennae twitched rhythmically. The great beast of the river bared its bloodied fangs and let out a furious roar, as if announcing its claim of the remains of the titanic turtle. This demented old snake. Did the serpent not want to live? Why was it going around challenging great monsters? Am I really such a delicacy? Sunny did not know what the giant butterfly was thinking, but one thing was certain. It did not like that serpent's challenge. It did not like it at all. Chapter 1262. A shrimp between 2 whales plus, turn off reset. Chapter 1262. A shrimp between 2 whales. Sunny described what was happening in a hushed voice. He didn't really need to whisper, considering that they were surrounded by a dome of silence, but it made him feel better. And what was happening appeared pretty clear. The monstrous butterfly had been attracted by the smell of blood and arrived to feast on the corpse of the black turtle that the Azure Serpent had so laboriously killed. The Azure Serpent, meanwhile, was having none of it. In fact, judging by the madness burning in its eyes, the great beast was overcome with the bloody desire to rip the giant butterfly apart as well. Visit for the best novel reading experience. This thing really doesn't know what's good for it, huh? What was the reason for the Azure Serpent's reckless insolence? Humans often described nightmare creatures as mad, but that description was not entirely accurate. The abominations were indeed insane, but that did not mean that they lacked sanity. Rather, it meant that their sanity was perverted, sinister, ineffable, and entirely different from what humans deemed sane. So why would the great beast risk its life fighting much more powerful monsters? Was it indeed madness? Was it pride? Was it reluctance to give up such an enormous prize? Or was it more reluctant to surrender 2 human souls that burned the flames of divinity to the stronger abomination? Whatever the reason was, the stubborn Leviathan seemed ready to battle the monstrous butterfly to the death. The butterfly let out an indescribable sound. The waters of the great river suddenly grew restless, rippling as they were assaulted by the powerful sonic waves. The serpent roared again, rising higher above the river's tumultuous surface. I think they are going to fight. Sunny was not sure what it meant for the 2 of them. He was belatedly happy about his decision to abandon the skies and seek shelter on the shell of the black turtle. If something like that butterfly had caught him in the air, he would have surely been dead in an instant. However, now that Nephi and he were trapped on the dark island, their fates seemed to be swaying on the edge of a perilous abyss. They were deeply unsure of their ability to slay a great beast, but a great monster was far more dreadful. They were only alive now because the Azure Serpent either lacked the ability or was reluctant to crawl out of the water. If the abominable butterfly won the battle, though, nothing was going to stop it from doing just that. Then, their shelter would turn into a deadly trap. A hurricane gale rose from the confounding fury of the great monster's lunge. It's attacking. A split second later, an enormous pillar of foaming crimson water rose into the sky. The serpent seemed to have managed to avoid the abominable butterfly's obliterating charge. However, its sharp legs tore at the sea creature's azure body. The great monster easily dove into the water, as though the depths were its home. Both creatures were suddenly hidden from view, and only the shaking of the island and the colossal waves that were assaulting its slopes showed that a titanic battle was happening underwater. They're fighting. Nephi's remained silent for a few moments, then gave him a strange look. Sonny, where are they fighting, in relation to our position? He stared at her in confusion, then said. Below water, to the left of the turtle's tail. She lingered a bit, then took a deep breath. Then, they're on the opposite side from the turtle's head. Where the entry wound is. So, while the serpent is preoccupied, shall we dive down and harvest some meat? He opened his mouth, startled. Then, he slowly closed it again. Dive down? Harvest meat? Are you crazy? Damn. I said it again. Nephis looked at him very seriously and shook her head. No, I'm not crazy. I'm hungry. Chapter 1263 Sea of Blood. What they were trying to do did, indeed, seem a little crazy. There were two great abominations fighting on one side of the black turtle, and Nephis wanted to dive into the water on the other side to steal some of the turtle's meat. Because she was hungry. But, of course, it was really not that unhinged of a plan. She had not suggested it out of a burning desire to satiate her belly, rather, it was out of necessity. The longer they were to go hungry, the weaker they would become. The weaker they became, the slimmer their chances of survival would be. Neither Nephis nor Sonny knew if they would get a better chance to harvest the black turtle's meat than now, when the Azure Serpent was distracted. In fact, they did not even know if they would live long enough to enjoy the fruits of this perilous decision. If the monstrous butterfly won, they would probably die soon. But there was nothing they could really do about that, so, the only thing they could do was prepare for the other outcome to the best of their ability. Grimacing, Sonny looked away and shook Imp off his thigh. Curses. Then, he gritted his teeth and started climbing out of the fissure. Hungry, she's hungry, is she? Just what sin did I commit in my past life to be cursed with all these gluttonous women? Oblivious to his heartfelt plea, Nephis followed. It took Sonny just a few moments to scale the vertical slope of the deep fissure and climb onto the quaking surface of the dark island. It was shaking and swaying, pushed by the harrowing fury of the unseen battle that was happening below the waves. A split second later, Saint landed nearby, and a vast shadow crawled from the darkness to take the shape of a tenebrous steed. Neph arrived last, slowed down a little by the need to carry the fragile amphora in one of her hands. Imp had been left in the relative safety of the fissure, since he was of no use in the current situation. They needed to dive into the tumultuous red water to harvest the monster's meat, but they didn't have to be stupid about it. If something happened, Sonny could swiftly pull them away through the shadows, however, finding a proper shadow to dive into was hard underwater. And since the great river was in the throes of the battle between the Azure Serpent and the monstrous butterfly, its current could easily pull Sonny and Nephis apart. She threw him one end of the golden rope, and he hastily tied it around his left wrist while she tied the other end around her right. At the same time, light swirled around Neph's slender legs and formed into two silver anklets. Sonny stared at them in confusion for a moment before realizing that their function had to be similar to the nimble catch. He was a bit envious. Hers was not an armor-type memory, so she did not have to dismiss the white tunic. Ah. I want to be sponsored by a guilt-ridden saint too. Holding the black bow, Saint took a position that gave her a perfect view of the head of the dead monster and the seething water surrounding it. Her task was to protect, or at least try to protect them should either the serpent or the butterfly arrive. Nightmares could not help her in case the former showed up, but if the latter did, his speed would have to assist Saint in leading the butterfly away. The amphora was placed beside them. Sunny and Nephi's looked at each other one last time, then dashed forward and simultaneously jumped. The wind whistled in his ears. A few moments later, Sunny hit the crimson water and was instantly swallowed by it. It was like he had dove into a sea of blood. Everything around him was murky and red. Despite his best efforts, Sunny was momentarily disoriented, but regained his bearings after feeling a sharp tug on the golden rope. He found Neph through shadow sense, and followed her as she swam forward with purpose. She had already done this once, after all. Granted, there had not been two great nightmare creatures creating a storm nearby at that time. We need to be fast. Breathing with the help of the essence pearl, Sunny swam through the crimson waters of the great river. Chapter 1264 Gaping Wound. Visit for the best novel reading experience. Guided by a golden rope that glowed faintly into the red murkiness, Sunny swam forward. The waters of the river of time, mixed with the crimson blood of a great monster, were cold and tumultuous. The battle of two harrowing abominations had turned them into a whirlpool of raging currents. Just how far is this wound? Suddenly, Sunny saw something enormous appear from the murky red darkness and shuddered. He was swimming past the giant eye of the titanic turtle, now hollow and devoid of light. His figure was like a speck of dust in front of it. The Azure Serpent had long feasted on the black turtle's left eye, but the right still remained. Even though Sunny knew that the ancient behemoth was dead, he couldn't help but feel as if it was staring at him. Looking away, he pushed himself through the water. We're not far from the creature's neck, then. Every second could be their last, so Sunny was tense. The battle of the dreadful abominations could shift in their direction at any moment. More than that, the nimble catch allowed him to swim with great speed, and Neph's silver anklets were the same. However, she did not seem to possess a memory similar to the essence pearl, and had to hold her breath. They simply couldn't linger. Fortunately, the dark thoroughfare of the turtle's enormous neck emerged from the cloudy redness soon. It was encased in massive bands of tarnished silver, which overlapped to form a flexible, but impenetrable armor. Sunny caught up with Nephi's as they followed the road of silver to the point where the monster's neck ended. There, its armor was torn apart and bent, sharp jagged edges surrounded by bloody foam. The stench of blood was much stronger here, and the water was much darker. Nephi's changed her direction, knowing where to go. A dozen seconds later, they reached the gaping wound in the body of the great monster. Sunny froze for a moment. It looked exactly like one would imagine such a place to look. Not that people had reasons to try and imagine something so morbidly bizarre. The walls of the tunnel, which was mostly consumed by darkness, were uneven, spongy, and red. The lower half of it was covered by tumultuous water, while the upper half was filled with an almost unbearable stench of blood. Rivers of red were flowing from the walls and the ceiling, mixing with the dark water below. Sunny and Nephi's were standing on one of the vertebrae of the black turtle, which protruded from the bottom of the tunnel like a pale pink mountain. While he was looking around, she was breathing heavily. So, now. Before he could finish the sentence, the carcass of the great monster quaked once again, and the two of them were almost thrown off the slippery bone. Sunny had to grab Nephi's to prevent her from plummeting back into the seething water. A moment later, he realized that they were embracing, their bodies pressed tightly against each other. He could feel the softness and the heat of her skin through the thin fabric of the white tunic. Her striking gray eyes were close, too close, as well. Forgetting what he was going to say, Sunny remained motionless for a few moments. Then, he made sure that Nephi's had regained her balance and carefully let her go. So, now, all we have to do is carve some meat. Right? She cleared her throat, then raised the wisp of flame higher and looked away. Right. And return alive. Sunny let out a shaky sigh. Sure. One thing at a time. Chapter 1265 Dirty Job. Sunny had to spend a few moments calming down his wildly beating heart. Then, he looked around once again. The situation was much better than he had expected it to be. He really had not considered that the grotesque tunnel left behind by the Azure Serpent would be only partially drowned. Slicing through the flesh of a great monster was no easy task, and doing so underwater would have been even harder. More than that, he was less restricted in the use of Shadow Step now. But, most importantly, he could summon the covetous coffer. Opening the alloy chest underwater would have just resulted in the spatial storage being instantly filled with water. Now that they stood on a solid surface, things were different. Of course, the tunnel could be flooded at any moment, so they had to hurry. Sunny looked at Nephi's and flashed her a smile. Let's be quick. The sparks of light swirled around them, manifesting into memories. Nef's flame was replaced by a luminous paper lantern, and a sizable alloy chest appeared on the porous pink surface of the great monster's bone. A moment later, their weapons manifested. Am I reduced to a mere butcher's cleaver? Ah, such humiliation. Sunny almost yelped when a familiar figure emerged from the darkness. The Sin of Solace looked somberly at his disheveled appearance, then shook his head. He was still clad in the shroud of graceless dusk, not to mention perfectly dry. Damn fool. Sunny whispered a stifled curse and commanded the shadows to wrap themselves around the jade blade of the cursed sword, which Sunny whispered a stifled curse and commanded the shadows to wrap themselves around the jade blade of the cursed sword, which had manifested itself a split second before. Then, he hissed. Gods, you almost gave me a heart attack. Nephi froze for a moment and looked at him with a slightly startled expression. Oh, did I? Sorry. Sunny's eyes widened. What do you want to do? Sunny paused for a bit, then gritted his teeth. We've already taken the risk. Returning with empty hands would mean that it was all for nothing. We'll have to wait for a chance to do it all over again, and even if such a chance presents itself, we'll be much weaker by then. So, let's continue. I can pull us back through the shadows, anyway. Nephi nodded in agreement, prompting them to return to the arduous task of carving the turtle's flesh. Both of them were much more tense now. A few more slabs of meat fell into the covetous coffer, and at the same time, the shockwaves traveling through the island showed that the battling abominations were drawing closer to the creature's head. Eventually, Sunny lowered his bloodied hands and grimaced. That's enough. It is too dangerous now. Closing the lid of the alloy chest, he dismissed it and froze for a moment, concentrating his perception on the haughty shadow. He had left it with Saint and Nightmare, so it had a good view of the turbulent waters surrounding the black turtle's head. The water had been turbulent before, but now, it was simply boiling. Bloody foam was undulating like a stormy sea, and two enormous shadows could be seen far below, intertwined with each other. They were just under the entrance to the gaping wound at the base of the titanic turtle's neck. Time to go. Grabbing Nef's hand, Sunny pulled the two of them into the shadow. But nothing happened. The shadows remained ethereal and elusive, as if he had never possessed the ability to dive into their dark embrace. Sunny froze, then slowly looked down. He was still standing on the slippery pink bone. Shadow Step had failed to activate. Chapter 1266 Unexpected Complication. What's wrong? What's wrong? Two identical questions sounded at the same time, but they couldn't be more different. Nef's voice was tinged with a hint of sincere concern, while the voice of the sword wraith was full of biting mockery. Sunny was motionless for a few moments, still holding Nephi by her hand. He shivered slightly after his second attempt to use Shadow Step failed, and she must have felt it. He looked up at her and hesitated. When he spoke, his voice sounded hollow. My ability doesn't seem to work anymore. An insidious fear suddenly drowned his heart, and at the same time, the dark island quaked again, the source of the tremor much closer than it had been before. The fear was irrational and animalistic. It had little to do with their perilous situation, and more with that fact that his powers had abandoned him without a warning. It was as though he had suddenly found himself missing a limb. There was disbelief, confusion, dread, and, finally, terror. It took all his willpower to push that terror down. The sin of solace laughed. Ignoring it, Sunny forced himself to speak. Just give me a moment. He had no idea why Shadow Step, which had never failed him before, was suddenly ineffective. Perhaps something was wrong with the shadows populating the insides of the black turtle. If so, there was an easy way to check. A few moments later, the shadow lantern appeared in his hand, and a flood of shadows flowed out of its open gate. However, the result was the same. It was not the shadows that were wrong, but Sunny himself. Really, such an idiot. The damned sword wraith was having the time of his life. Sunny clenched his fists, then uttered through gritted teeth. I don't seem to be able to bring us away, at the moment. Sorry. Visit for the best novel reading experience. Nephi's frowned, then carefully looked around. After a short pause, she suddenly said. In hindsight, it makes sense. Feeling a sudden sense of hope, he raised an eyebrow. It does? She nodded. After hesitating for a moment, he suddenly pulled on the golden rope and pushed his tired body against the current once again, trying to make his way to the source of the strange glow. Nephi and Sunny climbed onto a frayed piece of cartilage and looked at the wall of the tunnel. Out there, hidden in the folds of torn flesh. He took a deep breath. Was an enormous, radiant crystal that shone with ethereal light. It was one of the two supreme soul shards that the death of the black turtle would have left behind. Sunny briefly glanced at Nephi's, then summoned the covetous coffer once more. The shard was too large to fit into the opening of the alloy chest, so he concentrated and changed it, keeping the shape but changing the size. A few moments later, the alloy chest seemed more like an alloy sarcophagus fit for a giant, or someone like the Shadow Spawn. I can't believe it. We came down to harvest some meat, but ended up with something like that, gods. I can't even imagine how much it would cost in the waking world. Actually, it wouldn't have a cost. These things are so rare that they can't be bought with money. Even though they were pressed for time, he just couldn't let this chance slip through his fingers. Neph, can you help me? Together, they hacked at the fold of the turtle's flesh to widen the opening, and then used all their strength to lift the massive soul shard and load it into the opened maw of the covetous coffer. After that, they had to plunge into the water again. Several torturous minutes later, Sunny and Nephi used the silver chains at the side of the island to scale the slope of the black turtle's shell, and fell side by side on the rocks in exhaustion. Knowing how Neph would look in her wet tunic, Sunny refused to turn his head and instead stared at the sky. The warm feeling of their arms touching was enough for him. They needed to move, to hide, but he was too tired. Just a few moments. Sunny took a deep breath and tried to calm down a little. Then, he suddenly let out a low chuckle. But it's funny. After examining the estuary key, he had thought it impossible to collect one, let alone 6 supreme soul shards. The idea itself seemed utterly preposterous. And yet, here he was just a couple of weeks later, in possession of one. It had just fallen into his hands, almost on its own. A strange shiver ran up his spine. It was then that Nephi suddenly raised her hand and whispered. Look. In the sky above the island, the monstrous butterfly was spreading its black wings once again. Chapter 1267 Candlelight. Sunny and Nephi scrambled in an attempt to find a hiding spot, but there was no need. Their first thought was that the dreadful butterfly had won the battle against the Azure Serpent. If that was the case, then their fates would be sealed. However, a moment later, a deafening roar shook the world, pushing them to the ground. Turning to the stormy waters of the great river, they saw a familiar creature rising to the surface. The serpent was looking the worse for wear, with countless deep lacerations covering its mighty body. Streams of scarlet blood were flowing down its azure scales, and its giant eyes seemed even more deranged than usual. Flames of indescribable, murderous malice were burning in their cloudy depths, but, for once, that malice was not directed at the two humans. Instead, it was aimed at the battered butterfly. Now that Sunny and Nephi had a few moments to observe the great monster in detail, they noticed that it was in a sorry state, too. One of its 6 legs was missing, and there was an ugly tear on one of its beautiful wings. Its body looked strangely disheveled, and although none of the white scales covering it were missing, many of them were covered with thin cracks. The great monster was retreating. Sunny froze, momentarily stunned. Even though he had hoped that the Azure Serpent would win the battle against the much stronger nightmare creature, he could not quite believe that it actually happened. Old snake, just what damned kind of abomination are you? It was already miraculous for a great beast to defeat a great monster. 2 of them, though? While not impossible, it was certainly abnormal. Even if the monstrous butterfly was an aerial creature, and was thus at a disadvantage while fighting underwater, the tenacity of the Azure Serpent was confounding. Sunny stared at the bloodied Leviathan somberly. As if sensing his gaze, the serpent lowered its snout and glared back at him. Crimson water was flowing out of its slightly opened maw. He shivered. It's no mere beast. Indeed, he should have known. His luck wasn't good enough to stumble on just any great beast. No, it surely had to be some kind of unique and singular existence, a damn monarch among all beasts. Fated wouldn't have it any other way. Maybe it was no coincidence that the Azure Serpent had come from much further upstream than the other 2 abominations. Ah, curse it. Sunny felt conflicted. On the one hand, he should be ecstatic about the fact that the harrowing butterfly was retreating. On the other hand, the ancient river serpent seemed much more dangerous now. The butterfly, meanwhile, was swiftly rising higher and higher. However, it didn't leave. Instead of disappearing into the distance, the great monster turned into a black dot once again and started to slowly circle the island from above. It looked like the creature was not giving up on the carcass of the black turtle, just recovering its strength and biding its time to make another attempt. The Azure Serpent threw one last hateful glance at it, and then dove into the water with an angry hiss. Soon, the island shook slightly, hinting that the abomination was devouring more of the turtle's meat, perhaps to restore its power. The tumultuous water slowly calmed down. Left in the sudden silence, Sunny and Nephi stared at the vast expanse of the great river in exhaustion. After a while, he slowly exhaled. I guess, it seems we survived. She nodded slowly. Can you wait a moment? Sunny felt warm and relaxed, so he didn't mind waiting. Sure. He watched her across the glowing embers with peaceful idleness. Nephi seemed to be looking for something. A few moments later, she found a splinter of the synthetic firebrick they had used to light the fire, and thrust it into the meat. Then, she touched it with the tip of her finger, and a wisp of white flame ignited at the top of the small stick. Sunny received the strange dish with a confused look. What is this? A faint smile appeared on Neff's face. A candle. He hesitated for a few moments, then scratched the back of his head. Why? She leaned back and shrugged softly. I'm not quite sure how many days it has been since the start of the nightmare. But, the battle happened at the end of November, and we spent around a week in the desert. So, it should be middle to late December now. Sunny frowned. And? Nephi sighed and shook her head. It means that it has to be winter solstice back in the real world. It's your birthday, Sunny. He stared at her in astonishment. Wait, she's right. Sunny had forgotten all about it. It was winter solstice, or at least close to it. Out there in the waking world, an army of sleepers was entering the dream realm for the first time, if Antarctica still stood, that is. It was also his birthday. He was turning 21. Huh. He tilted his head a little. 21. I didn't really think I'd make it so far. Good job, Sunny. He looked at the burning stick, not noticing the bright smile that appeared on his lips. Nephi leaned forward a little. If I were you, I would hurry up, and make a wish. Wish? Wish, wish. Hidden by shadows, Sunny's smile grew brittle and strained. Chapter 1268 Azure Serpent. There were a lot of things Sunny desperately wished for. However, the ominous words carved into a random piece of flotsam he had encountered by chance weighed heavily on his heart. So, he held himself back and made a point of not wishing for anything. A pity. Sunny blew out the improvised candle and hungrily sunk his teeth into the juicy meat. The taste of it was indescribable. So delicious. Nephice had really outdone herself this time. To think that she could cook up something so tasty with so few ingredients, even the memories of the grotesque tunnel could not slow Sunny down. He attacked the roasted meat like a hungry wolf, annihilating it in no time. He still had to put some effort into chewing, but that only made the rich flavor and delightful texture last longer on his tongue. Some time later, both Sunny and Nephice were pleasantly satiated and sprawled on the ground, looking very much like Imp. Sunny was very much relaxed and sleepy, as well as in a great mood. Well, it was his birthday, after all. Surviving one more year was enough of a reason to celebrate, especially considering how many odious things he had lived through to get to today. Plus, the great monster's meat, which Nephice had marinated and roasted over the coals, was truly sublime. Come to think of it, she had silently assumed the role of the cohort cook from the moment they met on the forgotten shore. Whenever the cohort was together, Nephice was the one to feed everyone. The dishes she prepared were always filling, flavorful, and just right. The cohort was together, Nephice was the one to feed everyone. The dishes she prepared were always filling, flavorful, and just right. That was a strange talent of hers. Maybe I should hire her as chef when I open my restaurant. Sunny smiled. There was one thing slightly bothering him, though. A talent like this did not really fit her stern and knightly persona. How come Nephice knew how to cook? So splendidly, at that? Sunny turned his head and looked at her. Hey, can I ask something? Why are you so good at cooking? Doesn't seem like something you would be passionate about. Of course, it didn't. Nephice was only passionate about one thing, and to such a startling degree that it left no room for any other passions. She remained silent for a few moments. Wilderness survival. He raised an eyebrow, surprised. Anyway. Good night, Neph. There was a moment of silence, and then she dismissed the memory lantern, plunging the deep fissure into darkness. Good night, Sunny. The carcass of an ancient behemoth floated on the currents of the great river, and two humans slept peacefully in a crack in its shell. Their lives slowly changed after the appearance of the dreadful butterfly, but, strangely, not by much. Both Sunny and Nephice spent their days pretty much as they had before. They trained together, ate together, and rested on the soft moss together. Sometimes, Neph would go off to practice swordsmanship on her own, while Sunny would study the estuary key or sit motionlessly for hours, observing the Azure Serpent. He could feel his technique slowly improving as the small imperfections left within its principles and application were tempered and refined. He could also feel his understanding of the great beast deepening bit by bit. Only the key of the estuary remained a complete mystery. By now, Sunny had a faint suspicion that its weave encompassed two separate patterns. One was hidden within the other, with its function aimed inside. The other was much more vast and complicated, with its function directed outside. Both were stunning, ingenious, and inseparably intertwined. He had no idea what either of the patterns was supposed to do, though. Troublesome. When the tapestry of black strings started to blur in front of his tired eyes, Sunny would turn his attention back to the Azure Serpent. The frenzied creature was not having a great time. It continued to devour the flesh of the black turtle day after day, waiting patiently for the opportunity to consume Sunny and Nephice. But, now, it had to contend with the monstrous butterfly, which was a harrowing adversary. The butterfly descended from the sky on the third day after their first battle, and then again on the sixth. Both times, the two great abominations fought to a bloody draw, and the winged horror chose to retreat. Nephice hid in the fissure while the creatures were battling, but Sunny secretly stalked them from the shadows. Extending his shadow sense deep into the water, he followed the Azure Serpent as it furiously fought against the great monster. Watching someone fight with their life on the line was the best way to truly get to know them, after all. Just these two battles pushed Sunny's understanding of the mad Leviathan further than days of peaceful observation. The Azure Serpent was proud. And powerful. And absolutely insane. Its madness was even more terrifying than the sinister frenzy consuming the minds of all nightmare creatures. It was also insidiously cunning and exceedingly lethal, possessing a frightening combat acumen that must have been honed by experiencing thousands of perilous battles. This was why the great river serpent managed to send the more powerful creature retreating 3 times in a row. On the 7th day after their first battle, however, a new change shook the Dark Island. Chapter 1269 Third Contender. This time, Nephice was the first to notice the anomaly. Sunny and she were resting after an exhausting spar. He was meditating with his eyes closed, while she was leaning her back on him, still catching her breath. He sensed a sudden tensing of her muscles, and then the warm pressure was gone. Opening his eyes, Sunny glanced at Nephice and noticed that she was looking intently into the distance, where the endlessly flowing waters of the great river were sparkling under the light of the 7 suns. The Azure Serpent was nowhere in sight, and the island was not trembling, which meant that it was circling the stone shell of the black turtle. The monstrous butterfly was a small black dot in the sky. What had caught her attention, then? What is it? Nephice lingered for a few moments, then pointed at a distant patch of water downstream of him. There. Can you see it? Following her gaze, Sunny studied the currents. After a while, a scowl appeared on his face, too. I can. But what are we looking at? There, still far away from the Dark Island, a span of the great river seemed different from the rest of its vast expanse. From their position, it was no larger than a coin, which meant that the strange anomaly was thousands of meters wide. It did not seem too threatening. The water surface was simply a bit rough there, as if rippling under a strong gale. The problem was that such a gale would probably affect a larger area, not just a relatively small and strangely distinct patch of water. A much bigger problem was that this patch seemed to be moving purposefully in their direction. Sunny wasn't sure at first, but after observing the river for a dozen seconds, he grew certain that it was no mere coincidence. In these dozen seconds, the rough patch had already drawn visibly closer. His face darkened. It has to be another abomination. Nephi slowly nodded. I think so too. Also, what's a cachalot? Nephi let out a quiet sigh. It's like a whale, but with teeth. Sunny blinked a couple of times. Did whales not have teeth? He knew what a whale was, in theory, but not the details. They were all extinct, anyway, probably. Who knew what was happening in the oceans? The two of them watched tensely as the patch of rough water drew nearer and nearer, revealing its true size. It was indeed several kilometers wide, and much more tumultuous than it had seemed from afar. The water inside the patch seemed to be boiling, which looked rather strange considering that the river around it was as calm as ever. A minute later, the Azure Serpent let out an angry roar, and at the same moment, Sunny slowly rose to his feet. Curse it! The water was not really boiling, and there was no titanic behemoth moving under its surface to cause the ripples. Instead, there were thousands, perhaps even tens of thousands of small creatures moving forward at a terrifying speed, coming closer and closer to the island. It had taken him so long to notice because their insect-like bodies were almost entirely translucent. Each was as long as his arm, with countless thin legs, beady black eyes, and long, disgusting mouths that were full of vicious, glass-like teeth. Standing by his side, Nephice whispered. Krill. Sunny shifted his perception and shivered after noticing the vile darkness spreading through the bodies of the repulsive creatures. Each of them was of the corrupted rank. It was not another great behemoth that had been attracted by the scent of the black turtle's blood. Instead, it was a swarm of thousands and thousands of abhorrent corrupted beasts. Chapter 1270 Pinnacle of Strength. Even after living through the horrors of the Southern Campaign and witnessing the chilling resolution of the Battle of the Black Skull, Sunny still paled at the sight of the enormous swarm of corrupted beasts. There were too many of them to count, but there had to be tens of thousands of translucent crustaceans advancing toward the island. Even Nephi seemed taken aback, a rare sight, and not a welcome one. She instinctively outstretched a hand, as if summoning a sword could save them from the plague of corrupted abominations. It's all right. Her voice was even, but lacked confidence. Sunny forced out a faint smile. How exactly is this all right? Nephis lingered for a moment. These creatures don't seem capable of leaving the water. Follow current novels on NOV/3LB, in, co/m. Sunny closed his eyes for a moment. Yes, the abominable Krill were probably incapable of crawling onto the island and devouring them. However, they were more than capable of devouring the Azure Serpent. And with the old snake gone, nothing would prevent the dark butterfly from landing on the shell of the slain great monster. That's right. You are going to die. He flinched and glared at the Sin of Solace, who had appeared out of nowhere and looked at him with dark glee. The sword wraith laughed, and then whispered. Better yet, you are going to watch Nephis die. Isn't it poetic? Sunny tried to ignore the vile apparition, but this time, it was much harder than usual. With the words of the Sin of Solace still echoing in his ears, he forced himself to look away and stare at the river. Below them, the Azure Serpent lowered its head stubbornly, huffed, and suddenly shot toward the Krill swarm with tremendous speed. The water parted and foamed where it passed. Sunny could not see the great beast's eyes, but he knew that they were filled with bloodlust and fury. That snake did not know when to retreat. Or rather, it never wanted to. Its lust for slaughter and destruction seemed much greater than its desire to exist. The giant jaws opened and snapped, grinding 100 krill into dust. It was like a drop in the ocean. Then, the serpent did something strange. It suddenly spun, as if trying to turn its long snout into a drill. Sunny did not see how this could help the great beast against the swarm of corrupted abominations, but in the next moment, he opened his eyes wide. Following the spinning motion of the Leviathan, the waters of the great river were stirred, forming a long whirlpool along the length of its colossal body. That underwater whirlpool was like liquid armor, the current powerful enough to repel the attacking krill. The Azure Serpent's jaws opened again, and another roar shook the world. When they closed, numerous translucent abominations died. The battle was too furious, too grand, too inconceivable. Standing on the shell of the dead behemoth, Sunny and Nephis watched in silence as a lone great beast resisted myriads of corrupted creatures. Looking at the foaming water, they couldn't help but feel small, and weak. And insignificant. Unnatural powers? Humans were bestowed with aspect abilities despite being mere beasts, but nightmare creatures were different. Only devils possessed dire powers similar to those of an aspect. The Azure Serpent was not a devil, and did not possess a sinister ability. However, it was not powerless. Instead of relying on an unnatural power, it relied on its terrifying body, absolute control over it, and a deep understanding of its natural domain to make the river itself a power. Sunny had been wrong. The Azure Serpent did possess a weapon to use against an enemy that could not be crushed through pure strength. That weapon was its mastery of water. This is it. I see now. I understand. He had spent countless hours trying to comprehend the Azure Serpent, but always felt that a crucial piece of the puzzle was missing. A fundamental truth that was at the root of all other insights, and without which they were meaningless. Now, Sunny finally felt that he had found the thread which had to be pulled to unravel the mystery. Below them, the ancient Leviathan was fighting against a harrowing swarm of abominable krill. The battle had only just begun, and there was no saying which side would win, and which side would be destroyed. The Azure Serpent possessed a dire weapon, but was that weapon enough to survive the onslaught of tens of thousands of corrupted beasts? One way or the other, they were going to know soon. Chapter 1271 The Krill. The battle between the Azure Serpent and the Krill swarm did not last long, but it was the most terrifying event Sunny had seen since entering the third nightmare. The great beast completely lost its mind as it fought the legion of vile abominations. Stirred by its fury, the water seethed and roiled, sometimes exploding into colossal fountains of scarlet foam, sometimes rising in titanic waves. The magnitude of these undulations was so severe that the whole island rocked and swayed like a ship caught in the middle of a world-ending storm. The cacophony of wrathful roars and thunderous sonic booms merged into a deafening litany, to the point that both Sunny and Nephice were forced to plug their ears. Thousands of attacking Krill were destroyed, but the swarm did not seem diminished at all. Instead, no matter how furiously the Azure Serpent fought, more and more abominations were lunging at it, their thin legs moving in gluttonous anticipation. Updated from. At first, the water armor the Leviathan had created protected its prodigious body, but eventually it failed. One Krill struggled past the repelling current of the whirlpool, then 2, then 100. Their teeth scraped powerlessly against the impenetrable azure scales. However, after suffering through 3 dire battles with the dark butterfly, the Azure Serpent was battered and littered with wounds. Its body had already been covered by countless scars before, and now, there were numerous new ones. Some scales were broken, some cracked, and some were missing entirely. It was only a matter of time before one of the Krill managed to draw blood, then 2, then 100. Even though their size was minuscule in comparison to the great river serpent, they were corrupted abominations nevertheless, and their painful bites added up. The pain did not slow the Azure Serpent down, though. Instead, it became even more enraged, even more deranged, even more frenzied. The battle, which had already been frightening to look at, suddenly exploded in intensity, reaching a realm that went beyond fear. Standing on the swaying shell of the black turtle, Sunny and Nephice watched the boiling river with pale faces. Before Sunny knew what was happening, he found himself holding Neph's hand. He did not know which one of them grasped the other's hand first, but felt that this simple touch was his only lifeline in a world that had lost all reason. He also did not know how much time had passed. All Sunny knew was that the battle was changing. The Azure Serpent did not manage to destroy the Krill swarm. However, the swarm had also failed to consume the serpent. You have slain a corrupted beast, River Locust. Your shadow grows stronger. Without stopping to listen to the spell, Sunny sensed a flood of shadow fragments pouring into his soul and drew the string of the warbow again. He did not hope to stop the advance of the Krill swarm, and neither did he hope to help the Azure Serpent prevail. Even if Sunny killed 100 abominations, he wouldn't be putting a tiny dent in the swarm. Rather, what he was doing was pure opportunism. Nephice needed to burn the enemy with her flames or consume the soul shard like a normal awakened to receive fragments, but Sunny just needed a kill. So, he could just as well use the opportunity to strengthen himself. Sunny managed to fire off a few soul arrows and the strike of thunder once more before the Krill reached the black turtle, reaping a rich harvest of lives. Then, however, it became too dangerous to remain near the edge of the island. Even though the revolting creatures could not crawl out of the water, they showed themselves capable of jumping out of it with enough force to propel their translucent bodies through the air. After one of the Krill landed a mere dozen or so meters away from them and scurried forward before being pierced by a black arrow, Sunny and Nephice decided to retreat. Below them, thousands of corrupted beasts were fruitlessly trying to bite into the impregnable black scales of the dead behemoth. Some, however, were already swimming into the gaping wound under its flipper. Further away, the Azure Serpent finally managed to break the cage of the greatly diminished swarm and shot through the water in pursuit. It looked terribly mangled, bleeding from 1,000 tiny bites. Some of the Krill even seemed to have burrowed into the open wounds, just like the serpent itself had burrowed into the body of the black turtle before. Despite that, the great beast seemed just as murderous and consumed by madness as ever. The old snake did it. It actually won. Even though many Krill had managed to reach the carcass and swim inside, the swarm was undeniably broken. The Azure Serpent, and the 2 humans it was hunting, were going to live another day. Chapter 1272 Paradise Lost. That night, the island was quaking without pause. Sunny and Nephice hid in their fissure, not daring to close their eyes, even though a mass of impregnable black rock separated them from the flesh of the black turtle. It was unnerving to know that thousands of corrupted beasts were currently slithering somewhere below them, shredding the meat of the great monster with their terrible glass-like teeth. The Azure Serpent was also there, hunting down the invaders. Although they couldn't hear its roars, the violent vibrations spreading through the island told them what was going on. Sunny looked away from the shimmering runes, somewhat startled at how easily he had earned a large amount of shadow fragments. After another violent tremor had shaken the island, he finally closed his eyes. However, it was not to sleep. Instead, Sunny tried to convince himself that he was the Azure Serpent. He was crawling through the grotesque tunnel of bleeding flesh, which he himself had created to kill the hateful carapace monster, furiously hunting the vile creatures who dared to steal his trophy. His long, mighty body was burning from pain, but Sunny did not care. All he cared about was slaughter, blood, and retribution. Noticing a tiny worm gnawing on the wall of the tunnel, he let out a terrifying growl and shot forward, destroying the vermin and tearing a large chunk of meat out of the wall with his powerful jaws. But, behind it, more vermin were revealed, stolen meat digesting in their transparent stomachs. With madness painting the cloudy world red, Sunny roared and slammed into them with obliterating fury. Is this the feeling? Am I on the right path? Opening his eyes, he stared into the darkness with an absent expression. Then, he looked at Nephice. Some time later, Sunny said, I feel like our chances of making it off this island alive are dwindling. She remained silent for a while. So what if they are? White flames ignited in her eyes, illuminating them with a pale radiance. On that day, to their horror, they discovered a deep crack snaking its way through the surface of the black turtle's shell. It was not too large, but the fact that the stone carapace of the dead monster had been broken from the inside was indescribably concerning. Next morning, Nephice went to the edge of the island instead of practicing with Sunny, as they usually did, and spent several hours staring at the water. Then, she brought back disturbing news. The carcass of the black turtle was higher than it had been before. The parts of it that had been hidden underwater were now dry and exposed. This meant that a considerable amount of the dead behemoth's flesh had already been devoured by the Azure Serpent, the marauding Krill, and the Pale Thief, thus reducing its weight and increasing its buoyancy. It was also the reason why the swaying and the shaking of the island had grown much more severe lately. The carapace of the black turtle was deteriorating and cracking under the strain of harrowing battles raging around and inside of it, and at the same time, it was being gradually hollowed out by the nightmare creatures of the Great River. Their titanic shelter was slowly coming undone under them. Worse yet, in the coming days, the number of abominations arriving to feast on the corpse of the titanic monster only increased. There were more Krill, more dwellers of the deep, and more winged horrors being lured to it by the scent of blood. It was a carnival of horror. The Azure Serpent and the Dark Butterfly were like champions among them, slaying all invaders and occasionally clashing with each other. But that only made the situation worse. Now, the dreadful inhabitants of the Great River were attracted not only by the blood of the black turtle, but also by the blood of unfortunate abominations that had been slain in their attempt to feast on the turtle's meat. This can't go on much longer, it just can't. Both Sunny and Nephice knew that doom was swiftly approaching. However, there was nothing they could do. No matter how much they hoped and how diligently they watched the horizon, there was no sign of anything that could save them. There was no land and no ships anywhere in sight. There was not even a piece of flotsam drifting on the waves. Only a vast, deep, and endlessly flowing expanse of water that shone under the dreamlike radiance of the 7 beautiful suns. Chapter 1273 Collapse. Sunny! Wake up! Sunny opened his eyes and tensed. Sensing the world through the shadows, he couldn't feel any danger, but there was urgency in Neff's voice. Something was wrong. As his mind entered a state of battle readiness, he pushed himself off the ground and briefly studied the fissure. It was still night, so everything was enveloped in deep darkness. That darkness, of course, could not hinder his sight. Sunny saw every detail of their small camp and of the weathered walls of black rock surrounding it. Follow current novels on NOV/3LB, in co/m. Everything seemed fine. Saint, who was guarding them from high above, was also calm. He turned to Nephice and asked, "What is going on?" She pressed a finger against her lips and whispered. There was a sound. The next moment, he heard it too. A dull, echoing crackle that came from somewhere below, spreading through the rock in a subtle vibration. Like a stone breaking. He frowned. What is this? Sunny and Nephi's froze, listening to the eerie sounds coming from within the carapace of the black turtle. They had not dared to venture there after salvaging the meat. The shell had been hollowed out, but they didn't know by how much, and even though they had heard the sounds of nightmare creatures inside the carcass of the great monster from time to time, this crackling was entirely new. A small whirlwind of sparks appeared in the air, manifesting into a softly glowing paper lantern. Placing it on the lid of the covetous coffer, Nephi lowered her head and pressed her ear to the ground. There was another cracking sound, and she suddenly flinched. At the same time, Sunny's pupils narrowed as he noticed something that was out of place in their fissure. A small, thin crack appeared on the floor of the ravine. Just as Neph flinched, it suddenly grew, spreading through the black rock in both directions. Standing dazedly above the newly formed pit, Sunny and Nephi looked down with bleak faces. Their camp, where they had spent so many peaceful nights, was gone. Much worse, the dark island was showing signs of breaking apart. It was just a part of the central region today, but there would be more collapses in the future. Eventually, the entire shell would crumble, leaving them stranded and lost in the sea of deadly abominations. After almost a month of peace, they finally reached a true crisis. Sunny and Nephi looked at each other, not knowing what to say. Eventually, he broke the silence. We need to get off this island. Nephi lingered for a moment. Yes. But how? Sunny looked away with a dark expression. He didn't know. It was not as if they had not been preparing for this inevitable situation. They had tried to come up with a feasible plan dozens of times. However, there was no such plan to come up with. The Azure Serpent was still waiting for them in the water, and the dark butterfly was still ruling over the sky. Worse than that, many more abominations were prowling the surrounding waters, including the harrowing swarms of Krill. If the island sank, they were going to die. If it didn't sink, the Azure Serpent would eventually be killed, and they would be devoured by either the monstrous butterfly or some other great nightmare creature. There seemed to be no escape. Staring into the pit filled with stone rubble, Sunny sighed. Now, it finally feels like a real nightmare. A sad smile appeared on his pale face. Chapter 1274 Time of Truth. The 7 suns were shining in the azure sky. Sunny was sitting close to the slope of the island, staring fixedly at the flowing water. His eyes were dark and tired. With the temporary camp destroyed, he felt strangely homeless. Much worse, neither he nor Nephi had managed to come up with a viable solution for their fatal problem. They had considered many things. Updated from. Every memory in their possession had been studied and examined, but none of them, nor any combination of them, revealed a way out of the perilous situation. The best they could hope for was prolonging their stay on the carapace of the black turtle, somewhat. They could use the dark shaper to try and repair the cracks in the stone shell. There were other unreliable measures, as well, but that would just buy them a few more days, at most. There were other memories that they could use to try to escape. But attempting escape was tantamount to suicide. The great nightmare creatures guarding both the water and the sky were not something they could outrun. Then, there were Sunny's shadows. He had once thought that Saint was their best hope of slaying the Azure Serpent. However, after witnessing the mad beast in battle, he didn't think that the taciturn knight could achieve such a feat anymore. Not only because she could not enter the water, but also because his plan to augment her with both the shadows and the white flames had been crushed. Saint could not receive the blessing of the fire. Or rather, she could not reap its full benefits. The augmentation had worked perfectly fine in his basement before could not reap its full benefits. The augmentation had worked perfectly fine in his basement before the southern campaign, but Saint underwent a fundamental transformation after that. She was now a devil whose body and soul were infused with elemental darkness. And while true darkness somehow worked in tandem with Sunny's shadows, it refused to accept Neph's light. Saint could either use one or the other. In any case, the result was not nearly as powerful as Sunny had imagined it to be. They could bestow the power of Shadow Flame on his other transcendent devil, though. Sadly, Imp was not nearly as formidable of a warrior as Saint. On top of that, the little bastard was in a coma. Or a food coma, at least. The scrawny goblin had finally stopped devouring the tarnished silver and fell into a deep slumber. Sunny had a hunch that after the great mass of mystical metal was fully digested, his gluttonous fiend would grow much stronger. But there was no telling how long it would take, so he sent Imp into the nurturing black flames of his soul to complete the evolution in peace. In any case, Imp was of no help for now. The same went for Nightmare. The tenebrous steed had loyally guarded their dreams and subjugated a good number of them, but he was still an awakened terror. Even if the black stallion managed to unlock his terror ability, he was no match for a great beast, let alone a great monster like the dark butterfly. Ignoring the apparition, Sunny looked away and stood up. There was only one way to leave the island. He had known it for a long time, but felt reluctant to admit it. However, there was no time to lie to himself anymore. Now, it was the time for the truth, no matter how hideous and terrifying it was. Walking through the crumbling landscape of the dark island, Sunny found Nephice. Despite everything, she was still practicing with her sword. The lethal blade, and its master, were both beautiful. The world of the great river was lethal and beautiful, too. Sensing his approach, Nephi stopped and glanced at him with a composed expression. Sunny took a deep breath before coming to stand next to her, looking into her eyes. "I have something to say." She nodded slowly. "What is it?" Sunny lingered for a moment, then offered her his hand. "Give me your flame." "All of it." Nephice frowned slightly, a hint of concern appearing in her striking gray eyes. "Why?" He looked at her silently for a while, thinking. Sunny had told the old snake that Ruin followed wherever he went. But, really, he was the one following Ruin around most of the time. The two of them followed each other, unable to separate, just like a shadow and a star casting it could not be separated. They were quite a pitiful pair. Eventually, he steeled his resolve. "Because I am going to kill the Azure Serpent." Chapter 1275 Last Resort. Everything that needed to be said had already been said. Everything that needed to be done had already been done. Granted, there was not much to these preparations. Sunny and Nephice were in a desperate situation, and they could only escape it by resorting to desperate means. This was going to be it. They were either going to live or die. Sunny looked at the weathered surface of the black turtle's shell as they walked to the shore. The black rock, the green moss, the deep fissures with murky water glistening in some of them. He had spent the first month of the nightmare here. It was a harrowing place, or rather, it was supposed to be harrowing. But, strangely, all he could remember about the dark island were happy memories. Training with Nephice until sweat covered their bodies and a pleasant fatigue settled in their muscles. Laying on the moss and staring at the dreamlike sky, unbothered by the movements of the world. Eating delicious meals and drinking cool, sweet water. Bathing in the warmth of a campfire as they talked to each other, surrounded by darkness. All of that was coming to an end. It already had. He was reluctant to let go of this harrowing paradise. But there was no other choice. Maybe I truly am mad. Sunny had entered the nightmare utterly crushed. From Falcon Scott to the Battle of the Black Skull, he had tasted nothing but bitter failure. He had wished to be strong. He had made this wish come true, only to find out that it was of no use in the end. As if to mock him, fate had obliterated everything. However, somehow, he had truly been content on the dark island. Sailing through a river of unholy blood on the corpse of a dreadful monster, being pulled into the past by the current, he had been happy on that journey, and happier still to share it with someone he was fond of. Was fond of so much. He had been having fun in the depths of a nightmare. So what if I'm mad? He would need madness to survive today. New novel chapters are published at novelhall.com. The three of them, Sunny, and Nephice, and Saint, reached the slope of the island. Below them, the great river was flowing endlessly, bleak because of the encroaching night. The darkest hour, the brief time after the suns had already plunged into the river but before the vast expanse of clear water started to glow with soft radiance, was swiftly approaching. Sunny took a deep breath. Sunny shook his head, then took her hand, transferring the essence pearl from his soul into hers. I was joking, you know? Nephice lingered for a moment. Suddenly, she gripped his hand tighter and looked him straight in the eyes. I wasn't. He held her gaze for several long, poignant seconds before freeing his hand with a sigh. Then, Sunny glanced at Saint. You know what to do. The graceful knight raised her bow with indifferent grace. She had to play an important part in the battle. Two Nephice might not have been able to augment her with the white flames, but Saint had been wearing the stifled scream for an entire month. Better yet, just as Sunny had thought, sailing on the great river had a strange effect on the transcendent charm. By now, the enhancement it gifted to the taciturn shadow was much greater than it was supposed to be. Even without the augmentation of the shadow flame, she was frighteningly powerful. Finally, Sunny looked back at Nephice. Do it. He felt the purifying warmth flowing into his body and soul, strengthening both. At the same time, all 5 of his shadows wrapped themselves around him. In an instant, Sunny felt strong enough to crush the black rocks with his bare fists, and shake the entire world with his steps. Turning to the great river, he took a deep breath and whispered. Lost from light. Remember. This is your name. Then, he opened the gate of the shadow lantern and allowed a flood of shadows to flow out of it, drowning the slopes of the island. They flowed down like an avalanche of darkness, eventually touching the water. Sunny closed his eyes and dissolved into the shadows. In the next moment, the shadows moved, and something tore free from their dark embrace. A giant serpent with scales as black as onyx manifested itself from the darkness and dove into the water with a deafening roar. Chapter 1276 Dance of Monsters. Sunny was ready for battle. Now, he wasn't Sunny anymore. He was a mighty serpent, clad in an armor of onyx scales, with fangs as sharp as diamonds and enough fury to incinerate the world. But that was not enough. Following his wrathful roar, the shell hiding below his scales turned into the adamantine mantle. A fearsome obsidian armor encased his flexible body, light as a feather and crafted so intricately as not to restrict his movement in any way. The water exploded into the air when he dove into the depths that belonged to him, and him alone. Old snake. The call escaped his monstrous maw, turned into a senseless roar. What he had done was simple, but also indescribably hard. He had dove deeper into shadow dance than ever before, mirroring both the mind and the physique of a nightmare creature. He had not been sure that it would be possible until the last moment, but his meticulous preparation paid off. It was do or die, nothing less. He had spent countless hours observing the Azure Serpent and learning everything there was to learn about it. Then, he dissolved into the shadows, and manifested himself back into a tangible form. Finally, he summoned the dead shadow of the black turtle, which he had lured into the lantern, to form a mighty shell around his fragile incarnation. But, for the first time, the shape of his shell was not that of the shadow fiend. Instead, it was the shape of a monstrous river serpent, the shape of the mad beast whom he feared, admired, and wanted to kill. Of course, this shadow shell could not compare to the real thing. He was only an ascended, after all, while the Azure Serpent was a great beast. It was weaker, less resilient, and smaller, maybe a quarter of the size of the actual abomination. However, it was suffused with the power of both shadows and soul flame, granting it power well beyond the limits of what an ascended could possess. It was also protected by the mantle, and made to reign the depths. Only, there was another challenging his reign. A maddening fury consumed his mind, and he shot forward through the water like a black spear. He could feel it, the scent of blood spilling from the mangled body of the older, stronger beast. So what if it was older? So what if it was stronger? The two of them clashed furiously as they ascended from the depths. The Azure Serpent was much larger, more powerful, and terrifyingly domineering. The Black Serpent was smaller and more nimble, circling around the dreadful beast and delivering vicious bites one after another. However, even without being caught in the Leviathan's jaws, Sunny was suffering tremendous harm. As their bodies brushed against each other, a vast stretch of the mantle cracked and shattered. The shadows below rippled, the internal structure of the shell twisting and breaking apart. The violent currents created by the passing of the Azure Serpent's body were slowing him down, and his dark flesh was sliced open by the creature's dorsal fin. His shell was bleeding shadows. His essence was being burned. His mind was drowning in pain and derangement. More. 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 Despite knowing that it would cost him his life, Sunny felt compelled to bite into the enemy's flesh and never let go, to hurt the foe as much as he could, even if it meant death. To rip apart. To devour. To destroy. Instead, he continued to dodge the attacks of the Azure Serpent with clarity and skill, all the while attacking with hatred and fury when he could. And, all along, he was leading the great beast upward. Finally, they broke the surface and clashed again above the water. The suns were gone, and the river had not started glowing yet. The shaking world was dark. With a stifled roar, Sunny dodged the fangs of the Azure Serpent and tried to bite into an open wound on its mangled body, where white bone could be seen. However, before he could, the mad beast's tail crashed into him like an obliterating ram, sending fragments of the mantle flying through the air and a blinding flash of pain piercing in his soul. Arg! Sunny fell heavily into the water, and a tall fountain of white foam rose into the sky. The Azure Serpent let out a demented growl and lunged at him, aiming to bite the hateful worm in half. Before he could, however, 2 arrows, one black, one white, fell from the darkness and pierced its flesh. Saint and Nephis had joined the battle. Chapter 1277 Fourth Step. 1277 Fourth Step. Sunny had suffered to lure the Azure Serpent to the surface, but there was a good reason to guide the mad beast there. 2 reasons, even, Saint and Nephis. Although neither of them was as capable of fighting the abomination in the water as Sunny was, they could still play an important role in the battle. It was just that he had to create an opportunity for them to do so. And he had. As Sunny was convulsing from pain, 2 arrows struck the raging Leviathan. One was entirely black, as if forged out of pure darkness, which it was. Augmented both by her Mantle of Darkness and Blade of Darkness abilities, as well as the enhancement of the stifled scream, Saint's arrow pierced the Azure Serpent's one remaining eye. It was the darkest hour of the night, and so her strength was at its peak. More than that, this first shot she sent was empowered by the dreadful destructiveness of the Death Dealer enchantment, and so it delivered the most damage. And yet, the giant eye of the ancient Leviathan still wasn't destroyed. It was only damaged, becoming painted red, which made the mad beast look even more menacing. Sunny had put a lot of hope into this first salvo, but he was left disappointed. It didn't matter, though. During their violent ascent, he had been strategically trying to place himself on the side of the Azure Serpent where it was blind. However, there was no advantage to be gained there. Whatever senses the enemy was using to perceive his movements were perfect and precise, even without vision. His plan to blind the mad beast had been meaningless from the start. The second arrow was white. Its impact was not nearly as forceful as that of the first arrow, but it was still quite ferocious. Nephis had always used a sword, but it was simply a preference. As a legacy, she had been trained in the use of all kinds of weapons, and that certainly included bows. There was a powerful memory longbow in her soul arsenal, crafted by the Forge Masters of Valor, and several enchanted arrows as well. Even the true name was not a panacea. He also had to maintain his sense of self, while simultaneously denying it. Maybe this was the fourth step of Shadow Dance. The ability to preserve his identity while becoming truly formless in mind, body, and soul, and thus infinitely malleable, like all shadows were. As Sunny nimbly dodged the attacks of the Azure Serpent and lashed out with his sharp fangs and crushing tail, more arrows fell from the darkness. Saint was not using Death Dealer anymore, instead trying to weigh the Leviathan down with the help of Burden of Peace. Nephis was continuing to poison the great beast with the toxin of the bitter cusp. However, the abomination had quickly grown impatient with their harassment. Its movements changed slightly, and the next time the two shot their bows, a tall wave suddenly rose, washing the arrows away. That gave Sunny an opportunity to deliver a vicious blow, however. Coiling himself around a mangled span of the Azure Serpent's body, he slithered forward. His sharp dorsal fin bit into the mad beast's flesh, shredding it like a saw. The soft glow of the brightening water was suddenly painted in a crimson hue. Die, die, die. I am going to kill you. The Azure Serpent growled and lunged at him, madness burning in its bleeding eye. It was probably thinking the same. Chapter 1278 Mutual Destruction. 1278 Mutual Destruction. The great river was foaming and seething, gargantuan waves rising from its softly glowing expanse to crash into the weathered slopes of the crumbling island. Two dark silhouettes, one colossal, the other merely giant, were moving through the raging water, intertwined in a murderous battle. Sunny had been driven mad by pain and bloodlust. He lost count of the number of blows his obsidian, serpentine body had endured. He also did not know how many times he retaliated, biting the flesh and breaking the scales of the Azure Serpent. His mantle was in shambles, the living stone failing miserably to keep up with the barrage of devastating attacks he had to endure. The fearsome onyx armor was cracked and shattered, revealing the glossy black scales beneath. Many of its segments were entirely destroyed. The shadow shell that it was encasing had been shredded and ravaged, as well. Giant wounds were gaping on it, bleeding shadows. He had been able to repair some of the damage at first, but having the means to do something like that, it seemed so distant now. There was one thing that filled Sunny with dark glee, though. It was that the Azure Serpent looked no better than him. The body of the great beast had already been grotesquely mangled before their battle, and now, it was in an even worse state. The wounds that had closed were reopened. The wounds that had been opened were now wider and more harrowing, with crimson blood flowing out of them into the radiant water. Dozens of arrows were sticking out of the abomination's scarlet flesh. Some of them weighed it down, some sent a deadly toxin circulating through its bloodstream. But the Azure Serpent's eyes still burned with the same madness. Good, good, don't you give up on me, old snake. Sunny wanted to kill the hateful beast, but he didn't want that death to be swift. No, he wanted his enemy's agony to last forever. He wanted to tear its flesh with his fangs forever, feel the shudders of pain pulsing through its body forever, hear its pained cries forever. Control yourself. Snapping out of the consuming madness, he reminded himself of his goal. He needed to kill the Azure Serpent as fast as possible, not only because his essence was not limitless, but also because the chances of him being killed by the great beast were much higher than the other way around. If there was the smallest chance, he had to take it. It was just that, there were no chances. Still, there were none. The mad beast was still in full control of both itself and the battlefield. The water flowed and twisted to aid it and constrain Sunny, as if obediently following the ancient serpent's commands. Even with its body looking like that of a battered corpse and its mind flooded with pain, the Azure Serpent remained fixated on the solitary goal of destroying its opponent with a truly insane level of focus. He liked it a lot. This was the advantage he so desperately needed. Dangerous flames ignited in Sunny's onyx eyes as he twisted his long neck and glared at the reeling serpent. The great beast must have been growing weaker, as well. His attacks and the arrows of his companions were slowly grinding down its boundless endurance. The abomination had been a split second too late and failed to evade being rammed by Sunny's serpentine head. Which finally gave him the chance. First, the water. The water had been constraining Sunny, and so, he had to wrestle the control of it from the Azure Serpent first. With his understanding of the great beast and the experience of watching Neve and Bloodwave fight, he could achieve dominance for a few moments, at least. Coiling his mighty body like a spring, Sunny shot forward with incredible speed. He moved it in a specific way, forcing a powerful current to rush outward and collide with the opposing one, which had been created by the ancient Leviathan. A great whirlpool appeared where the two currents collided, and he tore through it, unopposed. Second, the target. The target was the Azure Serpent's titanic spine. Sunny had to sever it no matter what. Usually, the spine would have been protected by layers of impenetrable muscle, a layer of impervious skin, and a dreadful armor of indestructible scales. But the mad beast had been mangled and mutilated by the long weeks of warding off marauding abominations and the eerily monstrous butterfly. Large chunks of its flesh were missing, revealing bone. At a particular spot just below its head, a long span of the spine was revealed, too. That was a good target to choose, especially because the abomination would not be able to use its jaws to defend it. And, lastly, the advantage. Sunny did indeed possess an advantage in the battle of mutual destruction. It was because the Azure Serpent was made of flesh, while he was made of shadows. If he sustained too much damage, the shadow shell was going to fall apart, but his incarnation, which was small and hidden in its depths, could survive. It was just a matter of luck. Either he would be destroyed along with the shell, or get lucky and remain alive. But regardless of the outcome, the hateful Leviathan would die. I am fine with that. Growling viciously, the black serpent shot through the shining waters of the great river, and, discarding all pretenses of defense, closed his jaws on the great beast's spine. Chapter 1279 Raging Waves. Sunny bit into the spine of the Azure Serpent, igniting what little strength he had left into a violent and furious blaze. Billowing, shadows and flame rose from his onyx scales and wreathed him like a burial shroud. His eyes shone with mad, morbid, murderous malice and chillingly cold killing intent. His jaw pressed down with enough force to shatter mountains. But the spine of a great beast was much stronger than a mountain chain. It resisted his obsidian fangs, refusing to be broken, cracked, or even scratched. Die. Die. Drowning in fury, Sunny put all of his resolve, all of his hatred, and all of his desire into crushing the indestructible bone. He violently jerked his head left and right, gnawing on the spine like a rabid dog. If he could not bite through it, he would saw through it. If he could not saw through it, he would grind it down. The Azure Serpent was going to die, no matter what. It was already half dead, anyway. However, so was Sunny. He sensed the gargantuan body of the ancient Leviathan moving, and coldly refused to pay it any attention. It did not matter how the mad beast would try to destroy him, or if it would succeed. Sunny had already discarded his survival instinct. The mad beast could not reach him with its harrowing maw, which meant that it was not going to be able to kill him instantly. That was all he needed to know. As his fangs scraped against the spine of the Azure Serpent in a frenzy, the abomination's mangled body rose and ensnared Sunny like a crushing vice. Once he was caught in the coils, there would be no escape. He knew it, but he did not care. All he cared about was the feeling of a thin, shallow crack finally appearing under one of his fangs. The Leviathan's spine was giving. Die. As dark glee washed over his heart, the coils tensed, crushing his ravaged shell. The strength contained within them was unlike anything Sunny had experienced before. It was truly, and utterly, harrowing. Pressing down with harrowing strength, the Azure Serpent turned the marble carapace of the mantle into stone dust. The serpentine body beneath it was instantly broken, the onyx scales shattering, sharp edges of broken bones piercing the skin and protruding from the horrid wounds. There was blinding pain, but Sunny did not care. More cracks appeared on the abomination's spine now, spreading and merging with each other, and he could feel the giant body of his enemy twitching in pain. He could also feel fragments of bone sinking beneath his fangs. Instead of struggling to save himself, Sunny ferociously bit down on the damaged spine of the Leviathan and persisted in his frenzied attempts to break and mutilate it. Let's see which one of us dies first, old snake, as long as you die first. I don't mind dying second. T/S chapter is updated by. He couldn't even scream, because he had forgotten how. But, despite all that, he was satisfied. He was thrilled. He was happy. I killed it. Right? There was no way to know. But then, as if to answer his faint plea, a familiar voice whispered. You have slain a great beast, Dayron of the Twilight Sea. You have received a memory. The whispers flowed into his soul as darkness encroached on his mind. your shadow grows stronger. As the dark island swayed under the assault of furious waves, two broken silhouettes could be seen in the raging water, slowly drifting apart. One, much larger one, had a harrowing wound on its neck. Its spine was entirely snapped, and it was partially beheaded. A fire of indescribable madness was slowly fading away from the Leviathan's damaged eye, which was locked on the unmoving figure of the enemy even in death. The body of the Azure Serpent was slowly disappearing in the beautiful shine of the glowing waters as it fell into the depths. The other, smaller silhouette, was torn and ravaged beyond recognition. The serpentine body of the onyx beast was cut and broken, with harrowing wounds gaping across its entire length. It seemed to be on the verge of dissolving into a swarm of intangible shadows. Before it did, however, a graceful figure in a fluttering white tunic dove from the high slope of the island and plunged into the raging waves. Struggling against the furious current, Nephice endured the pain of her flaw and swam toward the onyx serpent. Chapter 1280 Beauty and the Beast Plus, Turn Off Reset. Chapter 1280 Beauty and the Beast. Sunny was drowning in a sea of pain. His mind, what little of it was left, had become faint and fragile, ready to collapse at any moment. But it had not collapsed yet. Actually, there was a piece of good news, too. The fact that he was capable of feeling pain meant that he was still alive. The fact that he was still alive meant that the Azure Serpent was dead. Otherwise, it would have finished Sunny off already. I won. It was a small consolation. The pain was so unbearable that he almost wished for death. However, Sunny was too attached to life to throw it away. If there was the tiniest chance to survive, he was going to desperately cling to it with everything he had. Before, he would have done it simply out of spite, but now, there were things he cherished and goals he wished to achieve. He really wanted to live. What the hell is happening? It was hard to form legible thoughts, but he somehow managed to evaluate his current state. Overwhelming pain, the loss of all senses, he was in shock. He was in a pain shock due to his shadow incarnation receiving severe damage. His soul had been wounded terribly. Which meant, what? He didn't know. What was he supposed to do? Was there anything to do? Arg, it hurts. For now, Sunny decided to do his best to endure the pain and hold his crumbling mind together. It wasn't easy, or pleasant, or possible, but he persisted. He persisted with everything he had. And, after an eternity of torment, there was finally a change. Sunny seemed to regain his hearing. The first thing he heard was Neff's distorted cry. Sunny! Don't die. Please. He was strangely annoyed. Crap, that was an order, wasn't it? She broke her promise. Not that it could change anything. It would have been great if Nephice giving him an order to survive magically restored his body and healed his wounds. But Sunny had to be able to execute a command for Shadow Bond to compel him into action or inaction. So, if Nephice suddenly decided to order him to go and bring her the moon one day, at most he would be forced to fruitlessly try his best. And he was already trying his best to survive. No really, who does she take me for? The soul flame. The soul flame was gone. He was only augmented by the 5 shadows now. Finally, Sunny noticed Nephice. Her small figure was on top of him. She must have climbed onto his giant body while he was floating lifelessly in the water, paralyzed by pain and on the verge of losing consciousness. Both of her palms were pressed against broken onyx scales, and her skin was shining with soft white radiance. Ah, she must have retrieved her flames. Nephice was healing him. But suddenly, her radiant figure exploded with light, dispelling the darkness of the night like an actual star. Sunny felt the familiar warmth, now much more intense than it had ever been before, flowing into him like a flood. And, embraced by that warmth, his broken form started to restore itself. As he felt it, startled, his deeply wounded soul was healed. His half-destroyed shadow incarnation was restored to a pristine state. And, shockingly, even his serpentine shell knitted itself back together. The harrowing wounds closed, the shattered onyx scales glued themselves back together. By the time Neff's radiance wavered and fell, Sunny was as good as new. The pain that had been tormenting him receded, then disappeared completely. He was alive again. Nephi's fell powerlessly on his wide back. She remained motionless for a few moments, then dragged her body up and clutched to two of the horn-like spikes growing from the crown of his head, where the dorsal fin ended. Right. The Azure Serpent was dead, but they were still far from being safe. In fact, they were in mortal peril, much more so than when the great beast had been alive. It was because there was no one to stop the dark butterfly from conquering the carcass of the black turtle anymore. Worse than that, the abominable creature had surely noticed a blinding star suddenly igniting in the darkness of the night. It was bound to descend upon them at any moment. So, it was time for the second part of the plan. We actually made it so far, huh? It was time to leave the dark island behind, and run. Let's go, Neff. Dismissing Saint, Sunny spent a split second to gather the strength permeating the vast expanse of his mighty, serpentine body. Then, with Nephi on his back, he lowered his head and dove into the endlessly flowing, radiant waters of the great river. Chapter 1281 Leaving the Dark Island plus, Turn off reset. Chapter 1281 Leaving the Dark Island. Sunny dove into the shining depths of the great river. His serpentine body was like a spear carved from black onyx, cutting through the radiant water with stunning, terrible speed. It was made to rule the sea, so no ship or vessel could compete with him in the deep. A great monster, though, visit for the best novel reading experience. Even though the dark butterfly was an aerial abomination, it had shown a dreadful ability to fight the Azure Serpent underwater with strange ease. They needed to escape being noticed by it, and so, Sunny swam down. Nephi's had the essence pearl, so he was not afraid of pulling her so deep that she would drown. That said, he was afraid of the depths. There was no telling what was hiding at the bottom of the great river. What kind of horrors lived there? Did time exist there, and if so, what was its flow? Sunny did not know, and he wasn't ready to find out. The plan they had concocted was to dive deep enough to avoid the notice of the dark butterfly and then travel downstream, gradually returning to the surface. He saw no reason to change it. As the onyx serpent moved down into the flowing abyss with a fragile human figure clutching to his horns, the dark island slowly disappeared in the distance. Its ominous silhouette was consumed by the radiance of the water, and soon, there was nothing around them but shining emptiness. Sunny felt a strange melancholy brush against his heart and steeled himself. They had finally escaped from the shell of the black turtle. That place, it had given him the peace and comfort he so desperately needed after the disastrous resolution of the dreadful and bitterly long southern campaign. For a while, it was like a paradise. But that paradise was a dark one. In the end, it had turned into a death trap, and now, they were leaving both the paradise and the trap behind. Don't look back. He refused to. There were, without a doubt, a lot of much more harrowing obstacles waiting for them ahead. And, hopefully, at the end of them all, they would be able to find a new paradise of their own. Existing as a shadow incarnation was consuming his essence, and sustaining the massive shape of the river serpent was consuming it as well. He had already spent a lot of essence fighting the mad Leviathan, and although Neff's flame was enhancing his soul to a degree, his reserves were not infinite. Even though he was a tyrant, they were not at all adequate for the task at hand. And so, Sunny had to hurry. He had to squeeze all the speed he could muster from his serpentine form while he could. If his essence ran out before they found land, or anything at all to climb onto, there would be no choice but to remain drifting in the water, slowly recovering their powers and hoping desperately that nothing would attack them in the meantime. The dwellers of the deep, the swarms of abominable krill, the flying predators that hunted creatures inhabiting the river. He didn't think that they would live long enough for their essence to be replenished. Praying that something appeared on the horizon, Sunny flew through the shining water. His powerful body cut through the flowing abyss, leaving a trail of raging turbulence in its wake. Nephi's clung desperately to his horns, exhausted by the explosion of healing flames she had created earlier to save him, and the harrowing pain of having to use her aspect for so long, and with such intensity. Strangely enough, Sunny had ended up in a better state than her, despite being the one who had fought in the battle with the Azure Serpent. The longer they swam, the more worried about her he became. But he was tired, too. His wounds might have healed, but the terrible mental exhaustion remained, smothering his ability to remain clear-headed and strive forward without rest. Slowly, a cold lethargy was seeping into his mind. Struggling against it, he continued to swim forward. Chapter 1282 Currents of Time. Sunny did not know how far, exactly, they had traveled away from the Dark Island, but the distance had to be immense. His shadow shell was not only enormous, it was also created to reign in the water. Considering that he was moving with the current of the great river, his already great speed was enhanced even more. So, he decided that it would be safe to rise to the surface. Gradually ascending, he tore through the radiant abyss and finally raised his head above the glistening waves. Still clinging to his horns, Nephi slumped down and breathed heavily. It had been hard for her to withstand the resistance of the water, which had been battering her like a ram for so long. The greater Sunny's speed was, the greater was the resistance. She had already been exhausted by straining her ability beyond its limit, and enduring the feverish race through the depths could not have been easy. But now that the onyx serpent's head was above water, Nephi could finally rest a little. The sky was still impenetrably black. A soft glow was rising from the river, illuminating the vast emptiness of its flowing expanse. The view was as dreamlike and magical as it had been on the first day Sunny had seen it. But his heart was pierced by despair. It was because even now, after leaving the Dark Island so far behind, he couldn't see any hint of land anywhere around them. An old doubt crawled into his mind, sapping strength from his tired body. What if there is no land? What if this whole world is nothing but water? Gritting his fangs, Sunny let out a quiet growl and strained every fiber of his shell to accelerate even more. With his onyx snout as the spearhead and his black dorsal fin as a sharp blade, he cut the glowing surface of the great river. Faster, faster, he was not out of essence yet. There was a certain sense of exhilaration he felt, flying toward the horizon with terrible speed. The speed, the might of his shell, the slender weight of Neff's body pressing down on his scales, and the empty vastness of the boundless black sky, it was almost liberating. But, at the same, his heart was drowning in anxiety, fear, and dread. And soon, he was proven right to be afraid. Sunny felt an ominous premonition and rose his head a little higher above the water. In the next moment, his serpentine eyes narrowed. There, ahead of them, the surface of the great river was seething and boiling. A boundless krill swarm was swiftly moving to meet them, hundreds of thousands of corrupted beasts burning with a mad desire to devour the onyx serpent and his rider alive. Sunny's enormous body shuddered, but he tried to remain calm. This is not the end. The krill swarm was a harrowing foe, but the terror of it lay in how numerous the river locusts were. The hungry legion rushing toward Sunny was the largest he had ever seen by far, enough so that even the Azure Serpent might have been unable to prevail against it. However, unlike the ancient Leviathan, Sunny was not constrained by the need to defend his prey, and while the krill were numerous, they were not individually strong. Much more importantly, they were not too fast. Cutting a sharp turn, Sunny roared and flew west, parallel to the approaching mass of abominations. His feverish thoughts dissolved into a simple, bestial need to outrun the swarm. The distance between them grew smaller with frightening speed, and yet he still couldn't see the edge of the vast patch of rough water. His incarnation disappeared next. Sunny turned intangible, and was then thrown out of the embrace of the shadows, finally regaining his human form. He was in pain. Every muscle in his body felt like it was about to burst. His lungs felt as if they were consumed by fire. His head was heavy, and his limbs were weak. He even failed to adapt to the change in time, swallowing a mouthful of water. Which was fine. He was dying from thirst, anyway. Sunny felt himself sinking, and struggled weakly to stay afloat. But even that was too much of a strain. Am I going to drown? A moment later, a strong arm embraced him, and he felt Nephi's pressing his body against hers. Swimming with the help of her one free hand, she pulled them both upward. Soon, their heads broke the surface of the water. Sunny was momentarily blinded by sunlight and coughed, trying to push air into his lungs. It's over, we won't survive the few days needed for our essence to recover. As he tried to think of anything that could keep them alive, a strange shiver suddenly ran through Nef's body. Since she was still hugging him from behind, he could feel it clearly. Sunny. Sunny. He tried to answer, and was suddenly struck by the strangeness of his human body. It felt alien and tiny, not at all befitting a ferocious serpent like him. He had forgotten how to talk. Snap out of it, damn it. Sunny slowly gathered his senses, remembering what it meant to be human. Then, he moved his unfamiliar tongue and said hoarsely. What? Nephi moved, turning them both to face downstream. Her voice was just as hoarse as his. There. He frowned, following the direction where her finger was pointing with his gaze, and then froze. There, on the water, no more than 100 meters away. A small boat was swaying on the waves, both of its sails lowered. It was made out of beautiful dark wood, with intricate patterns carved along its sides. There was no movement inside, but the boat seemed to be staying in place, strangely unaffected by the strong current of the great river. And so, they were being slowly pulled in its direction. Chapter 1283 Ketch. A small wooden vessel was resting on the sparkling water. The 7 suns were rising from the distant depths, and the world was painted in the lilac hues of early dawn. Illuminated by that beautiful light, the vessel seemed like an illusion. What is this? His hoarse voice was full of disbelief. It was just too improbable, to find an empty boat swaying gently on the waves just when his essence had run out, and despair had taken hold of his heart. The great river was inconceivably vast, and yet, they had just happened to find themselves a mere 100 meters away from a boat at that exact moment. Even when, fated, was involved, the coincidence seemed too convenient. It was to such a degree that Sunny even considered that he was hallucinating, wouldn't be the first time, anyway. Maybe the Sin of Solace had learned a new trick. However, Nephi saw the boat, too. She hesitated for a moment, then said numbly. It's a ketch. Sunny was about to ask what the word ketch meant, but he was too tired for unnecessary questions. It was probably a type of boat, regardless. Nephi knew about these things, considering that she had even built one for them, back on the forgotten shore. It was probably also a part of her legacy training. The two of them remained still for a few seconds, then swam toward the ketch. Well, Nephi was the only one swimming while supporting Sunny. He just weakly moved his legs to help her a little. Soon, they reached it. Sunny placed his palm on the hull of the sailboat, still unsure if it was real. However, the dark wood felt smooth and solid to his touch. He traced his hand across it, both stunned and relieved. It might be a trap. Even if it was, they had no choice but to climb into the ketch. It was too small to protect them from great abominations like the Azure Serpent, but anything was better than nothing. More than that, the ketch couldn't be as simple as it looked. It was drifting in the harrowing waters of the great river without a scratch on its hull, after all. A mundane boat would have been destroyed in a matter of hours here. Even the piece of flotsam that Sunny had once used as a raft, which was tough enough to withstand the nails of a master, was turned into tiny splinters. It had to have been a part of a large vessel before turning into flotsam, too, and that mysterious vessel had ended up being destroyed. Everything was made with a mundane, but exquisite level of craftsmanship. The wooden surfaces were tastefully engraved, showing all sorts of flowing images, now smoothed out by the wind, water, and passage of time. The ketch seemed like the loving creation of a supremely skilled artisan, even if it had seen better days. One look was enough to tell that the wooden boat was very old. However, it had been maintained with the utmost care, remaining in near-perfect condition. Sunny was musing about who could have taken care of the ketch when his gaze finally reached the stern, where the steering oar was supposed to be. Unlike the chain breaker, there was no runic circle for the helmsman. Instead, there was only a very mundane wooden bench. And there, on that bench, a corpse was sitting with its head hung low. His body suddenly grew stiff. What? Sunny was momentarily paralyzed by shock. Because that corpse, it looked eerily familiar. It was shrouded in a dark mantle, which made it hard to determine whether the body belonged to a man or a woman. All that he could see was that the person was of small stature, and terribly thin. Their long white hair moved slightly in the wind, and their face. The face was obscured by a mask of black lacquered wood. The mask was carved to resemble the face of a ferocious demon. Its teeth were bared, with 4 fangs protruding from its mouth, and there were 3 twisted horns rising from it like a crown. Inside the black chasms of its eyes, there was nothing but pure darkness. It was Weaver's mask. And the corpse was just like the one he had found beneath the ruined cathedral of the Dark City, all those years ago. Chapter 1284 Hail Weaver. 1284 Hail Weaver. Sunny found himself unable to move for a few moments. Encountering the Ketch just when they desperately needed shelter was already shocking enough. Finding a corpse that looked eerily similar to the nameless prisoner of the hidden dungeon beneath the ruined cathedral inside the Ketch, it sent him into a fugue state. All kinds of wild thoughts rushed through his mind. For a split second, Sunny even imagined that it was his own corpse, brought here from the future by some strange anomaly of the mystical river. But, no. The proportions were all wrong. He was not a tall man, but the mysterious person was even smaller. They were practically tiny. In fact, now that Sunny had taken a good look at the corpse, he realized that it was different from the prisoner of the ruined cathedral, as well. The dark mantle and the mask were the same, but the body hidden beneath them was not. Even with its features obfuscated, he could tell the difference. Still, what was the meaning of this? How could there be another Weaver's mask? Who were these 2 people, and how could they be so similar despite the great divide between the Dark City and the Tomb of Ariel? Nephi seemed startled, as well, albeit for a different reason than Sunny. She did notice his strong reaction, though. Sunny? What is it? She must have noticed that the mask the corpse was wearing was the same mask Mongrel wore. She also knew that it was a divine memory of the 7th tier, even if Sunny had never told her where Weaver's mask came from. He took a deep breath. That corpse, it's just like the one I found in the Dark City, beneath the cathedral. That was where I got the mask. Sunny had found the spawn of the vile thieving bird by pure coincidence, even if that coincidence might not have happened without the influence of fated. Everything that followed after absorbing the drop of ichor that contained blood weave, however, was the result of logic and reason. It was the consequence of that first chance encounter. Guided by the ability to see the radiance of divinity, which bloodweave granted him, he explored the cathedral of the Dark City and received Weaver's mask. Guided by Weaver's mask, he dove into the sky below, reached the ebony tower, and discovered Weaver's severed arm, thus acquiring bone weave. What was the cause of this situation, then? Was it a coincidence or the result of his choices? As Sunny was spacing out, consumed by these thoughts, Nephi looked at him with a frown. Corpse? What do you mean? He shivered, updated from. Could she not see the hunched figure sitting on the helmsman's bench? The old woman's small, hunched body was frail and thin, as if ready to collapse from the smallest gale. The dark mantle hung listlessly from it, a few sizes too big. Nevertheless, she was emanating a feeling of unimpeachable dignity, willpower, and sanctity, even. The black mask fell to the deck of the Ketch with a wooden clack. The old woman was looking at Sunny and Nephi silently, one moment passing after another. And then, she moved. Bending down, she groaned and slowly kneeled. Sunny was startled, but most of all, he felt a strong urge to jump forward and stop her. It felt incredibly wrong, to see such an old woman prostrating herself, let alone in front of him. He noticed Neff's back growing stiff, as she felt the same. The corner of her eye twitched. But neither of them moved. Finally, the old woman's knees touched the deck. Placing both hands in front of her, she took a shaky breath, and then kowtowed deeply. Her quiet voice sounded like a scraping quill. Hearing it, Sunny flinched. She said, "Hail, Weaver, demon of fate." In the silence that followed, he hesitated for a while, and then answered. Firstborn of the unknown. The old woman remained motionless for a few moments, and then let out a long sigh. Lowering her head even closer to the deck, she spoke with reverence. Ananke greets the children of Weaver. Erdil's note, ah. These are my favorite type of chapters, the lore drops. Super excited to see what she has to tell about the Weaver. What do you guys think she meant with children of Weaver? Could be Neff and Sunny alone, or it could be everyone connected to the spell. Who knows, who knows? Chapter 1285 Ananke. Ananke greets the children of Weaver. The word hung in the air. Sunny and Nephi glanced at each other warily, both confused by this strange situation. Why was the old woman prostrating in front of him? Why had she addressed them as children of Weaver? What is going on? Sunny was tired out of his mind, and the inexplicable nature of the strange old woman was simply too much for him to process. Visit for the best novel reading experience. She didn't seem hostile, at least. With a sigh, he allowed his exhausted body to collapse and sat down on the wooden deck of the Ketch. Nephi, meanwhile, hesitated for a few moments, then took several steps forward and carefully pulled the old woman up. Please rise, grandmother. Do not bow on our account. Responsible for the great calamity that had befallen Earth, or maybe for its salvation. Regardless, old Ananke seemed to have a deep connection to Weaver, and the owner of the Ketch, Ananke, allowed herself to be gently pulled into a sitting position. Then, Nephi returned to Sunny and sat side by side with him. The two of them were now facing the old woman, waiting for her to say something. But she remained silent. After a few moments passed, Sunny frowned. He felt nervous. There was no telling just how powerful this woman was, and what her intentions were. Ananke was a complete mystery. She could also provide answers to many mysteries that had plagued him. So, he asked. I am sorry, grandmother, but why did you call us the children of Weaver? Nephi remained silent for a few moments, then remarked evenly. You don't seem to be surprised by the fact that we come from the future. Sunny forced himself to focus. It was a very poignant question, and one that he had failed to think of himself, distracted by the avalanche of revelations. The old woman slowly nodded, her breath ragged. It seemed that it was hard for her to speak for so long, but she still forced herself to answer. Of course, I am not surprised. Haven't you come from upstream, my lord and lady? Nephi and Sunny glanced at each other. They had indeed. The natives of the great river, which flowed from the future into the past, would have had a different perception of time. For them, people from the future might not seem that strange. Ananke took a breath, then added tiredly. Oh, but I was also warned that you would come. Huh? That was perhaps the most shocking revelation yet. After a moment of silence, Sunny raised an eyebrow while hiding how shaken he truly was. Warned? How? The old woman nodded again, her unbound white hair moving in the wind. I received a message, in my dreams. A message that the children of Weaver would come. And that. She paused for a few moments, catching her breath, then finished fervently. And that I must help them reach fallen grace, where dusk, the last of the Sibyls, reigns. Chapter 1286 Fortuitous Encounter. Dusk. Sibyl of the fallen grace. Sunny shivered. Of course, he remembered who Dusk was. He was wearing a tunic called Shroud of Graceless Dusk, after all, the transcendent memory of the 6th tier he had received for slaying the terror of LO49. That damned horror. If he were to try and assign numbers to the enemies he had faced in Antarctica based on how many mental scars they left him with, the beautiful flower of floating white silk would be squarely placed second, right behind the winter beast. Even Goliath, who had literally killed him, did not leave as harrowing of an impression. Of course, Dusk was most likely neither dead nor corrupted yet in the nightmare. She was still a human, and seemed to be ruling a place called Fallen Grace. Since Sunny and Nephi wanted to reach the civilization of the Great River and find the Sibyls, this destination was perfect. It was a little bit too perfect, even. Ananke had answered one of the most important questions they had. The improbable coincidence of them finding her Ketch just when they needed it was no coincidence at all. She had come knowingly, expecting to find them. But who was it that had instructed her where to find them? In her dreams, no less? Who was pulling the strings of this nightmare behind the scenes? Is it, perhaps, the last Sibyl herself? Sunny frowned, knowing that he would not find the answer any time soon. The earliest opportunity was probably going to be when he came face to face with the Sibyl of the Fallen Grace, again. He sighed. Fallen Grace? How far is that? New novel chapters are published at novelhall.com. Old Ananke hesitated for a few moments. It is far. Very, very far. So far that I won't be able to guide you all the way there. She grew silent, her eyes closing slightly. It almost seemed as though she had dozed off. Then, however, the old woman shook slightly, and added. But I will take you as far as I can go, my lord and lady. Ah, you see, we demon followers weren't welcome here, in Ariel's tomb, either. They chased us away, and we traveled upstream for a long time before settling down and building Weave. Weave, it's one of the human cities on the Great River, like Fallen Grace. Or, at least, it used to be. Sunny and Nephice looked at each other. Why was it that Ananke was unable to return downstream? Was there some kind of internal strife between the locals of the Great River? Would it be dangerous for her to enter the waters controlled by the Sibyls? And what did she mean, that we've only used to be a city? Nephi spoke cautiously. We wouldn't want to put you in danger, grandmother. What if the food was poisoned? What if she was waiting until they fell asleep to kill them? Sunny glanced at the frail figure of the priestess. She looked too fragile and weak to pose any threat to them. Of course, looks could be deceiving, but he also felt that Ananke had been sincere and treated them with nothing except great benevolence. It was hard to dislike or distrust the kind, earnest old woman. Ah, whatever. Even if she had done something to the food, he was very hard to poison. Blood we've made him all but immune to most toxins, after all. Shaking off the mad desire to devour everything in sight, the faint remnant of the ferocious form of the river serpent, he tentatively picked up a savory pie, still warm from the oven, and took a bite. His hand trembled. Delicious, so delicious. Not wasting any more time, Sunny sent the whole pie into his mouth and chewed greedily. A few moments later, he raised his thumb and nudged Nephice with his elbow. She lingered for a moment, then followed his example. They ate and drank like two kids being spoiled by their grandmother, oblivious to everything else. Soon, the entire meal disappeared. They didn't even spare the wine. After that, Sunny felt incredibly sleepy. But it wasn't the unnatural feeling of having been drugged. It was simply the natural reaction of his abused body demanding some well-deserved and much-needed rest. Safe, we're safe, I think. Struggling to keep his eyes open, Sunny looked at Nephice. She was tired, too, and yet she nodded to answer his silent question. It's all right. I'll take the first watch. You can. Before she even finished the sentence, Sunny had already dropped his head on her lap, fast asleep. Chapter 1287 Blissful Ignorance. Sunny slept like a baby. There were no nightmares haunting his dreams, and when he woke up, his heart felt strangely at peace. He remained motionless for a while, feeling the warmth of Neff's hand resting on the crown of his head. The Ketch was moving swiftly across the water, carried by both the wind and the current, and the world around them was dark. It was already night. I overslept. Nephice should have woken him up. Had she gotten any rest herself? Turning his head slightly, Sunny looked up and saw her elegant jawline. She was leaning on the wooden side of the Ketch, her eyes closed. Her breathing was slow and deep. She was fast asleep. So, no one was keeping watch. Don't be upset with the lady, my lord. Sunny flinched slightly and glanced at the stern of the boat, where Ananke was still sitting, holding lightly to the steering oar. Her dark mantle was of the same color as the night sky, making it hard to discern where its folds ended, and the night began. you both needed rest. Sunny felt very comfortable laying on Neff's lap, but he had to sit up with a reluctant sigh. Rubbing his eyes, he looked at his shadows, which were all but invisible in the darkness. None of them showed any sign of being concerned, so he judged that the old woman had not tried anything strange while they slept. Even though it would take a few more days for his reserves of essence to be fully replenished, they were not dry anymore. Due to the shroud of dusk, he also felt rested and refreshed. However, he was slightly hungry. Sunny hesitated for a few moments, and then asked. Say, you wouldn't happen to have more of those little pies? Ananke smiled. There should be a few left in the box. Eat well, my lord. I made them with care. Sunny noted that the wooden box was not a memory that created food, but instead a storage memory that helped keep supplies fresh. Everything inside must have been prepared by Ananke in anticipation of meeting the children of Weaver. Opening the lid, he discovered a few leftover pies, as well as more fruit and a couple other simple dishes, all perfectly fresh and preserved. It smelled so wonderful that he remained motionless for a moment, enjoying the fragrance. Misunderstanding his hesitation, the old woman spoke. Teacher Julius would indeed be beside himself if he learned that Sunny stuffed his belly while an elderly woman starved herself nearby, even if that woman was just a nightmare inhabitant. More than that, just what kind of fish was she going to catch in the great river? Ananke hesitated a little, then took one of the pies with a shaking hand and smiled. Thank you, my lord. That is enough. When he went back to the box, Neff stirred slightly and opened her eyes. She stared at her empty lap for a few moments, then looked at Sunny and blinked a couple of times. Finally, she sniffed the air and turned to the wooden box, guided by the enticing fragrance of the freshly cooked food. Her eyes glistened. The two of them had a scrumptious meal while Ananke slowly ate her single pie. The atmosphere inside the Ketch was strangely peaceful. It was as though they were sailing on a calm lake instead of the deadly expanse of the great river, where all kinds of terrifying creatures dwelled. The water was glowing with soft opalescence, while the sky was impenetrably black. The beautiful vista of the world hidden within the tomb of Ariel was as dreamlike and mystical as ever. As Sunny looked at the surface of the water, he suddenly saw its light grow dim. There was a vast, inconceivable shadow moving somewhere unfathomably deep, below them, blocking off the radiance of the drowned suns with its endless expanse. For a few moments, a bleak darkness enveloped the entire span of the great river around the Ketch, and then indifferently moved on. He shivered and looked at Ananke, terror hiding in his lightless eyes. The old woman calmly held the steering oar as she smiled. Don't worry, my lord. They can't sense us. Sunny hesitated for a while, wondering if he should ask who the they she spoke of were. In the end, he remained silent. There were things that a person was better off not knowing. Sunny was not sure if he could allow himself the luxury of ignorance, but he decided to enjoy being ignorant still, at least for today. Chapter 1288 King Among Beasts. There were still a lot of questions Sunny wanted to ask Ananke, and a lot he needed to learn. But, surrounded by the silent darkness of the night, he simply listened to the gentle sound of water splashing against the hull of the swift Ketch and stared at the glowing expanse of the great river without saying a word. A lot had happened yesterday, gods. Was it really just a day ago that he had fought the Azure Serpent? The fearsome battle, the frantic escape from the dark island, there had not been a single moment of peace for him to settle himself and contemplate these matters yet. It feels like a dream. He had really done it, he had killed a great beast. Of course, it was partly due to the blessing of Neff's soul flame, as well as the fact that the Azure Serpent had been severely weakened. And yet, was there another master in the world who could boast the same feat? Surely not. Had there ever been? Sunny shifted uncomfortably, afraid that the incredible achievement would go to his head. He almost wished to hear the biting remarks of the Sin of Solace, who never missed a chance to bring him down. The bastard was somewhere nearby, but kept out of sight. He could feel the faint presence of the hateful wraith at the edges of his consciousness. Nevertheless, it was a fact, Sunny had indeed slain the Azure Serpent. Dayron of the Twilight Sea. What an unusual name for a nightmare creature. After observing the mad beast for so long and even assuming its form, Sunny was certain that there was something special about the ferocious abomination. Now, after learning its name, he came to strongly suspect that the Azure Serpent was not an abomination at all. Or at least had not always been one. Was the old snake actually a human once? Troubling. He glanced at the shadow of Dayron one last time, hesitated, and then said quietly, "Find peace within me, old snake. Your nightmare is over." The Azure Serpent had been a terrible enemy, but he had also protected Sunny and Nephice from the other horrors of the Great River. They wouldn't have been able to enjoy the blissful month on the Dark Island if not for his madness, hunger, and ferociousness. Sunny had learned a lot from the Great Serpent, as well. With a sigh, he turned away and walked to stand between the 5 black suns. There was still something he needed to see. Sunny had received a memory after killing the corrupted sovereign, after all. His first memory of the supreme rank. Well, his first memory of the supreme rank that he had actually earned, as opposed to mysteriously receiving it out of nowhere. Summoning the runes, Sunny found the unfamiliar string of them and read. Memory, Crown of Twilight. Memory rank, Supreme. Memory tier, I. Memory type, Tool. Chapter 1289 Crown of Twilight. A tool. Sunny wouldn't have minded receiving a weapon or an armor, but a tool could be incredibly valuable, too. After all, he already had the Sin of Solace. The Jade Sword was only of the transcendent rank, but it still possessed the ability to cut the flesh of great nightmare creatures, albeit with some effort. It was just that Sunny had to create an opportunity to use that ability first. He also had the Mantle and the Shroud of Dusk, and while neither of them was durable enough to resist an attack by a creature like the Azure Serpent, that problem could be solved by not getting hit. Both the lack of a suitable weapon and the absence of suitable armor could be solved. A powerful tool, meanwhile, would give Sunny more ways to find the solution. So, he was not disappointed. Feeling both the gentle swaying of the Ketch and the silent stillness of his soul sea, Sunny continued to study the runes. He hoped that the description of the Crown of Twilight would answer some of his questions. It read. Memory description, there was a king who ruled over a dying land. The king was valiant and wise. Refusing to embrace despair, he thought of an audacious plan, gathered his companions, and braved the endless desert to enter the tomb of Ariel, where the great river flowed endlessly from the future into the past. Thus, the valiant king became a guide who guarded his people in their nightmares. They built a city at the edge of dawn and gathered an army to vanquish that which was defiled. However, in the end, the army was destroyed, the city was lost, and the valiant king himself succumbed to madness. Consumed by wrath and resentment, he turned into a mindless beast and roamed the great river for countless years. Nothing could withstand his hunger and fury, until, one day, the mad king met a treacherous shadow. "But what do you even know?" said the shadow. "Do you think you're so special? I know fury, too. I know hunger, too. I know madness, too. Oh, and I've killed plenty of creatures more powerful than me, too. Who are you to dare stare me down, beast? I am lost from light, who was born from the shadows. I am the rightful heir of death and the bastard son of fate. Wherever I go, ruin follows. If you had any sense, you would have run away as soon as you saw me." Well, actually, there was some doubt. Nothing about the tomb of Ariel, and this particular nightmare, was normal. Still, Sunny believed that he was right. Dayron must have reached the Black Pyramid and entered the true Great River, as opposed to a version of it recreated by the spell. That next part, however, did not make any sense. He had become a guide who guarded his people in their nightmares? What did it mean? Sunny remained motionless for a while, then frowned. The most obvious answer was also the most confusing. The spell created nightmares based on the past. The Great River, however, existed simultaneously in the past, in the present, and in the future. So, if Dayron had truly entered the real tomb of Ariel, then he would be present in any recreation of the Great River conjured by the spell. Therefore, if his subjects challenged a seed connected to the Black Pyramid, their sovereign would be waiting for them on the other side, to help them conquer it. If I am right, then it was indeed an audacious plan. There was just one glaring problem with this theory. It was that the seeds of nightmares, and the nightmares themselves, had not existed in the ancient past of the dream realm. No explorer had ever discovered signs that its human inhabitants had possessed knowledge of the nightmares, and Noctis had not known anything about them either. So how could Dayron come up with a plan to use the uniqueness of the Great River to help his people transcend through a nightmare, if there were no nightmares at that time yet? Then again, Ananke was from a time when the seed of the spell had already existed. Granted, that time was at the start of the war between the demons and the gods, so Dayron could not have lived much later. That war was the cataclysm that no one had escaped. Arg, so confusing. In any case, Darren's plan had failed. Although many of his people managed to join him within the tomb of Ariel, they died trying to destroy that which was defiled, whatever it was. Actually, that phrase is perhaps the most important piece of information in the entire description. It was important, indeed, because it hinted at the goal of the nightmare. Which also meant that Sunny, Nephis, and the other members of the cohort would have to succeed where the ancient sovereign and his army had failed. Great. Sunny felt a bit of dread at the prospect, but, at the same time, he also felt a little relieved. At least he knew now they wouldn't really need to search for the mystical estuary of the Great River in order to return to the waking world. They just had to kill something that even a sovereign had not been able to kill. He was going to have to discuss this with Nephis. In the meantime, though, he still hadn't learned what his new, shiny supreme memory could do. Looking back to the shimmering runes, he read: Memory Enchantments, Legacy of Twilight, King's Resentment, Royal Promise. Chapter 1290 Royal Promise. Read latest chapters at novelhall.com only. Sunny raised an eyebrow, pleasantly surprised. 3 enchantments on a memory of the first tier, that was rare. As an amateur sorcerer, he knew just how hard it was to build a varied spellweave around a single nexus. Intrigued, he continued to study the runes. Legacy of Twilight, Enchantment Description. This memory greatly improves the rate at which the wearer's essence is replenished at the borders between day and night. King's Resentment, Enchantment Description. This memory grants the wearer complete immunity to mind attacks, but plagues them with irresistible wrath instead. Royal Promise, Enchantment Description. This memory infuses authority over water into the wearer's domain. The extent of this authority depends on the might of the domain. Sunny scratched the back of his head. Huh. The first enchantment was rather straightforward, and extremely useful, granted, that usefulness was situational. It would greatly speed up his recovery of essence at the borders between day and night, meaning dawn and dusk. The second enchantment was tricky. Complete immunity to mind attacks was an incredible trait to have, but it came at the cost of being consumed by mad fury. Sunny wasn't sure what to make of it. Luckily, it was an active enchantment, so he could use the other 2 without going berserk. But the third enchantment was simply confounding. There was dawn and dusk every day, too. So, he would benefit greatly from improved rate of essence replenishment twice a day, every day. Combined with the blessing of soul, of the Shroud of Dusk, that would put him in a very advantageous position, not to mention that here on the Great River, there were places where sunrise and sunset lasted endlessly, as if frozen in time. The King's Resentment offered stellar defense against mind attacks, the most dreadful kind, as far as he was concerned, but would turn Sunny berserk. The benefit seemed as great as the cost was terrible, or did it? He could easily think of situations where boundless fury would only be beneficial. Wasn't it almost like a dangerous, but potent boon? And lastly, the Royal Promise would give him a degree of control over water in a world where there was nothing but water. The value of such an ability was evident, but more than that, this enchantment also possessed the greatest capacity for growth. Sunny did not doubt that the sovereigns, the actual sovereigns of the waking world, would stop at nothing to possess a memory that could grant a second authority to their domains. Hell, since the independence of the House of Night was founded, to a large extent, on the fact that it was close to impossible to conquer the storm sea. The crown of Twilight could very well completely upset the balance of power between the great clans. The royal promise would allow any sovereign to add Night's territory to their own. And yet, here he was, a mere master, in possession of it. Sunny smiled. Who knows, maybe I'll be the one who conquers the House of Night. However, his smile quickly disappeared. Right now, even his chances of surviving the third nightmare seemed incredibly bleak. In case he did manage to return home, nothing would ever compel him to attempt the fourth. Nothing. Yeah, thanks, but no thanks. Somewhat sober now, Sunny sighed and dismissed the crown of Twilight. There was something else he had to think about. The battle with the Azure Serpent had been like a feverish dream. He had turned into a mad beast to fight the great abomination, but he had also managed to remain himself. More than that, it was the first time he had succeeded in using Shadow Shell to assume the shape of a nightmare creature. The shadow spawn was different, because he had lived in that body for many months. The form of the onyx serpent, however, had been constructed purely by observing the great beast and sensing his essence through shadow dance. As a result, Sunny felt that the mastery of the fourth step of his aspect legacy was already within his grasp. All he had to do was contemplate the revelations gained during the battle, absorb the knowledge, and integrate it into the systematic framework of shadow dance he had already established. The evolution was already in sight, he could practically smell it. Still, there was a bit of work left to do before he could reap the rewards. Closing his eyes, Sunny tried to remember the perilous, ferocious battle with the Azure Serpent in all its harrowing details. It was better to do it now, while the memories were still fresh, and the remnants of the serpentine form still lingered in his mind. Time flowed slowly. Chapter 1291 Perilous Gift. New novel chapters are published at novelhall.com. Shadow Dance was both the legacy of his aspect and a battle art Sunny had invented. That battle art was insidious, shapeless, and ever-changing. Its purpose was to steal that which made the enemy strong and use it to destroy them. The first step of Shadow Dance was the foundation of this ability. Sunny had mastered it during his bitter battle with Nephice, whom he knew all too well. It allowed him to peer into the very essence of the enemy's battle style and gain an almost supernatural understanding of what they would do, as well as the ability to mimic it. The second step was a continuation of the first. It was the same in all aspects except for scale. Assuming the persona of Mongrel, Sunny had battled countless awakened and absorbed their styles in order to make his ability more ubiquitous. He had mastered it during the final battle of the Dream Tournament, facing Morgan. That breakthrough deepened his understanding of the fundamental, governing principles of battle, which in turn allowed him to shadow unfamiliar and sophisticated battle styles much faster, and with greater ease. He also gained the ability to intuitively sense the unique ways in which his opponents utilized their soul essence to make those styles possible. The third step was different. It expanded on the first two, broadening the scope of Shadow Dance by redefining what a battle style was. Outwardly, that simply meant that Sunny had begun including nightmare creatures in the ranks of enemies he shadowed. Inwardly, however, the distinction was much greater. The third step had more to do with Sunny himself than with his enemies. After plunging into the alien and perverse minds of various abominations in the Red Colosseum, he still found himself falling short of an epiphany. That was because Sunny had to let go of his own sense of self to truly be able to shadow things that were innately different from him. He had to become more like the shapeless, formless shadows. He had managed to pass this impossible test because of the battle with Nightmare. The third mastery vastly broadened and improved his ability to shadow his enemies, as well as giving him the ability to perceive the flow of essence within them clearly. However, it also made Shadow Dance a double-edged sword. Sunny had found it easy to get lost in the form of an adversary, forgetting himself forever. The best defense against this risk was his true name, which served as the anchor of his soul. And now, there was the fourth step. It is even more dangerous. Sunny still felt the lingering remnants of the Azure Serpent paint his perception of the world. After delving into the form of the mad beast so deeply, he struggled to shake it off. A shadow? A memory? Or something else entirely, like another drop of ichor? Whatever it is. I hope Bloodweave doesn't gobble it up again. Suddenly bitter, he glanced at the horizon, and then hurriedly summoned the crown of Twilight back. Soon, the 7 suns rose from the depths and chased away the impenetrable darkness of the night. The dim twilight of dawn enveloped the Ketch for a brief period of time. At that moment, Sunny felt a flood of essence rush into his cores. Amazing. The rate of recovery was indeed greatly enhanced. Sunny had 5 shadow cores instead of 1, so it took 5 times as long for him to recover all his essence, without the aid of the Shroud of Dusk. With it and the legacy of Twilight, though, it felt as though he would be able to replenish his reserves fully in the span of a single day. Half at dawn, and another half at dusk. If he was even slightly frugal, he would practically never run out of essence. Feeling encouraged, he glanced at the frail figure of Ananke, then turned to Nephi's. Sunny silently pointed to the serpentine band of black metal on his head. It was time to ask more questions. Chapter 1292 History of Time. Updated from. Nephi nodded, indicating that she had read the description of the Crown of Twilight. The two of them could have communicated through the Blessing of Dusk to discuss how they would approach the conversation with Ananke, but really, there was no need. The old woman showed no indication of being someone they needed to be wary of. So, they could simply ask. There was one question that had to be answered above all else, though. Sunny shifted slightly, then called. Grandmother. Ananke stirred, as if waking up from a dream, and looked at them with her cloudy eye. Yes, my lord? Still uncomfortable with this form of address, Sunny thought for a moment and asked. Have you ever heard about that which was defiled? The old woman suddenly froze. Her hand, which was resting on the steering oar, trembled. For a while, nothing but the sound of water splashing against the hull of the Ketch could be heard. It seemed that she wasn't happy to hear that question. However, Sunny and Nephi's had no choice but to ask it. They needed to learn everything they could about the assumed goal of this nightmare. Eventually, Ananke sighed. That which was defiled. I guess you are talking about the defilement, my lord. The old woman nodded. Indeed. You are wise, my lady. The corner of Sunny's mouth twitched. That's the second time she calls Nephi's wise, 0 times for me, though. Still, he understood the idea. There were actually 2 concepts named time inside the tomb of Ariel. One was the flow of the great river itself, which was prone to all kinds of shenanigans, while the second was no different from the concept of time they were familiar with. The old woman continued. So, the great river has a history, as well. Or rather, it is us, the river people, who have it. That history started a long time ago, when the Sibyls first entered the tomb of Ariel with their people. There were others, too, all kinds of humans and creatures who came seeking truth, which is said to be hidden at the estuary. Her creaky voice grew wistful. That was when we, heralds of the nightmare spell, came to the great river as well. I was told that it was a golden age. The Sibyls established their cities, and powerful seekers built solitary manors among the waves. They had escaped the end, and lived in peace and prosperity within the tomb of Ariel. Sunny found something curious and asked. You were told? You weren't there yourself? Come to think of it, when Ananke had spoken about the persecution of the followers of Weaver, she had mentioned not experiencing it personally. That statement had sounded rather strange at the time, but there were many other questions that needed to be asked first. The old woman chuckled. Goodness, of course, no. I might look old, but I am not that ancient. No. I was born much later, after Weave was already established. Unlike those who have come from outside, like you, I am Riverborn. Sunny made a mental note that there was a distinction between the outsiders and the Riverborn, and continued to listen. Ananke took a hoarse breath, then said somberly. But that golden age, eventually, it came to an end. First, the voices of the gods grew silent, causing the Sibyls to turn their gazes to the estuary. And then, the defilement was born. Chapter 1293 Defilement. Ananke's weathered, wrinkly face grew dark. The old woman lingered for a while before saying, "The other name for the defilement is corruption, a special kind of corruption that appeared on the Great River and then spread from downstream like a plague. Or rather, was spread." Nephi's leaned forward a little. "Spread, from downstream?" The old woman nodded heavily. "Yes. It is because the defilement, its origin is the estuary." Her cloudy eyes grew distant. The Seekers were always trying to reach the estuary, traveling further and further downstream. But none of them succeeded in finding it. Eventually, they built a city of their own in the far reaches of the past, a city called Voyage. Its grandeur could compete with the bustling prosperity of the large cities ruled by the Sibyls, and from there, they continued their search. Until, eventually, one of them really managed to enter the estuary. The old woman gripped the steering oar as she looked at the vast expanse of the great river, then continued dully. However, what he found there was not the truth, but corruption. Or perhaps it was the truth that he found that corrupted him. That seeker became the first of the defiled, and he brought the defilement back with him to the verge. The city of seekers was consumed by the defilement, and those consumed by it became twisted and monstrous. They spread from there like a plague, bringing a great calamity to the river people. Ananke grew silent, breathing heavily. Sunny was scowling deeply. So that was what happened. The hideous truth that the demon of dread had hidden in the heart of the Black Pyramid, the first person who learned it was consumed by corruption as a result. Not only that, but he also infected the rest of the Seekers with it, destroying, or rather, transforming, an entire city into a nightmarish source of the spreading corruption. Of the defilement. Just what kind of secret had Ariel buried at the dawn of time? More importantly, was that what Dayron of the Twilight Sea had tried to achieve? Storm the corrupted city of Voyage and slay the first witness to the harrowing truth, who was the root of the defilement? If so, their task would be a dreadful one. Nephi seemed to be thinking the same. After pondering for a while, she asked, "Grandmother, do you know how the defilement spreads?" The old woman shook her head. "I am sorry, my lord. I do not. In truth, I've only met a true defiled once. Weave is situated too far upstream, so while we had to battle corrupted creatures of the future often, no one from the verge has ever reached us." Nephi frowned. "Except for that one defiled?" Ananke nodded. "Yes." The water was sparkling under the sunlight, and the Ketch was flying across the waves, traveling further and further into the past. Nephi hesitated for a moment, and then asked, "What happened when the defiled appeared?" The old woman did not answer for a while. Eventually, she raised her head and smiled bitterly. "The day he appeared, was the day Weave was destroyed." Her words traveled somberly across the surface of the water, soon disappearing into the wind. Chapter 1294 Corruption. In the morning, they enjoyed delicious food and fragrant wine from Ananke's wooden box. The old woman herself seemed a little bit more energetic today, but the long conversation had tired her out. She ate very little and returned to the steering oar, looking at the flowing water with a distant expression. She must have been thinking about her city, Weave, which had been destroyed by the defiled. Without having to discuss it, Sunny and Nephi decided to give their kind guides some privacy. They had to digest the many revelations of the past day, anyway. Sunny was leaning his back on the side of the Ketch, cradling a steaming cup of tea in his hands. Nephi was by his side, looking at the sky. After some time had passed in comfortable silence, he used the blessing of dusk to ask, "Read latest chapters at novelhall.com only. There is one thing I don't understand." She shifted slightly and turned to look at him. Sunny was suddenly painfully aware of how close they were. His pale face was reflecting in the calm depths of her striking gray eyes. He sighed. "She said that Weave was destroyed. And yet, she is taking us there. Why?" Nephi contemplated for a few moments. Ananke survived the destruction, so more people could have survived as well. If not, it would be to scavenge for supplies for the journey ahead. "We will see when we get there." Sunny took a sip from his cup, enjoying the warmth of the freshly brewed tea. The Ketch was swaying gently, and the view was heavenly. It was really hard to believe that they were inside a nightmare. What do you think about what we've learned so far? Neff's face darkened a little. She looked away and shrugged. The situation is better than I thought. It seems we have a clear enemy, at least. More than that, not all of the Great River is as dangerous as our starting point. I was wary, a little bit, thinking that every nightmare creature here is like the Azure Serpent, the black turtle, and that horrid butterfly. But it doesn't seem that way. She paused, then added somberly. There no sign of them? Sunny looked down with a grim expression. He shared that concern. However, I am concerned about the others. We all came from the same moment in time, so they should have been sent to the same region of the Great River. Why is there no sign of them? Sunny looked down with a grim expression. He shared that concern. Cassie, Effie, Kai, Jet, and even Mordred, where were they? None of them were easy to kill. He firmly believed that his friends were still alive, somewhere out there. Or at least, he wanted to. But it is strange, isn't it? You wanted to be free of the truth, so you didn't deserve it. He remained silent for a while, then sighed. Well, that's great. Now, we don't only have to be wary of nightmare creatures, we even have to be careful about what we learn. Damnation, you do know that I am a very curious guy, don't you, Neff? She looked at him, lingered for a bit, and smiled. Oh. I do. You are indeed a very curious guy. Lost from light, who was born from the shadows, rightful heir of. Sunny opened his eyes wide and hurriedly dismissed the mental connection of the blessing of dusk. Hey, hey. Nephi leaned on the side of the Ketch and laughed softly. What? He opened his mouth, then closed it again and gritted his teeth. Can you maybe forget that? Forever? Nephi looked away with white sparks dancing in her eyes. Can I? Well, I don't know. I have a very good memory. Sunny stared at her for a while, then scoffed. Admit it, though. You thought it was a bit cool, didn't you? I bet you did. Like you thought Mongrel was. Neff's face suddenly grew still. I absolutely did not. He grinned. Sure. But I have a good memory too. What was it that you said in that nightclub in NQSC? If I recall correctly. Nephi closed her eyes and yawned. I am so tired. I think I need to rest now. Sunny laughed. Really? Alright, then. Rest well. Chapter 1295 No One Knows. While Nephi was pretending to sleep, Sunny moved to the stern of the Ketch and looked at Ananke, who seemed to have paid no attention to their conversation. Sensing his attention, however, she turned slightly and asked. Yes, my lord? He hesitated for a few moments. I wanted to ask you about Weaver. The old woman smiled slightly, as if uplifted by his question. What would you like to know? Sunny remained silent for a moment. What didn't he want to know? Demons were surrounded by mystery, and while he slowly accumulated a lot of knowledge about them, much more knowledge than an average human in the ancient times of the dream realm had, most likely, there were still wide gaps in it. The problem was that Ananke was not really a person from the dream realm. She had been born in the tomb of Ariel and spent her life in isolation from the outside world. Still, she was a priestess of the nightmare spell. She had to know many things, even if some of that knowledge had undoubtedly been twisted as a result of becoming religious doctrine. So, he was unsure how much he would be able to learn from the old woman. Sunny scratched the back of his head. Well, for starters, was Weaver a man or a woman? He was really tired of stumbling over his words every time he tried to say something about them. Ananke chuckled. No one knows. Weaver was a master of lies, after all, so you should take anything that is known about the demon of fate with a grain of salt. Weaver was the firstborn of the unknown. His, or hers, domain was fate. And just like fate, Weaver was fickle, inevitable, and terrifying. Despite not possessing dreadful battle power, unlike some other demons, the demon of fate was feared the most. Sunny was not surprised. He couldn't imagine a more frightening enemy than someone whose weapon was fate itself. That said, he wasn't sure whether Weaver had been able to control fate, or simply perceive it. The latter seemed more probable, even if everyone had been convinced otherwise. Was that one of Weaver's lies? He inhaled deeply. Who was the unknown, then? The old woman smiled. The old woman, despite her age and wisdom, seemed a little bit naive. Sunny and Nephi's were not the worst people from the waking world by far, but even they had briefly contemplated attacking and killing her after discovering the Ketch. Yet she had never been on guard against them, instead treating them with utmost sincerity. Her unwavering trust in Weaver was just the same. He hesitated for a long time before speaking again. Grandmother. I don't mean to offend you, but hasn't that doom come already? Where is the salvation you were promised? Holding the steering oar, Ananke smiled softly. Why, it is right here, my lord. It is you, the children of Weaver. Sunny stared at her for a few moments, his expression incredulous. The old woman chuckled. You might have misunderstood me a little. When I spoke of salvation, I did not mean that my elders, who had accepted the mission of caring for the nightmare spell from Weaver, hoped to save themselves. The Doom War, it threatened to destroy all life, all humans, and all beings, everywhere, forever. So, what they really wanted to save, was the future. She paused for a few moments, took a shaky breath, and added. It might be strange to say this while sailing into the past, but the future, it is still ahead, and so, it can still be saved. Sunny pursed his lips. The dream realm was already a dead world, with only nightmare creatures populating its hellish expanse. And now, the spell had even infected Earth with the same plague that had destroyed it, forcibly pulling more humans there, in an attempt to do what? He sighed. How exactly are we supposed to save the future? We can't even save ourselves. The old woman shook her head. That is for you to know, my lord. Although I am a caretaker of the nightmare spell, I am not a person it was meant for. All I can do, is help those chosen, like you, brave the thorny path. As much as I can, with what little power I have. She smiled. Even if it's just for a short while. That is enough for me. Sunny remained motionless for a few moments, then rubbed his face. Well, isn't that convenient? Chapter 1296 Doom War. Sunny was not sure that he was buying what Ananke believed, but at the same time, he couldn't completely discard it. Damn Weaver. Just why did the creator of the spell have to be a nebulous and elusive creature, not only surrounded in mystery, but also obsessed with lies? Could there be anyone more untrustworthy? Even though Sunny had inherited Weaver's forbidden lineage, wore Weaver's mask, and had a high affinity to fate, which was Weaver's domain, he still knew close to nothing about the demon of fate. Where had Weaver come from? Who hid behind the fearsome black mask? What motives had guided them? What goals had they pursued? He shook his head with resignation and looked at Ananke, frowning. Whatever. If I can't learn about Weaver, I should at least learn everything else. Sunny collected his thoughts before asking the next question. Grandmother, you said that the purpose of the nightmare spell is to save the future from the doom of the great war between the demons and the gods. To be honest, I am not entirely sure what that really means. What exactly is that doom? What made the war so terrible? The old woman gazed at the flowing expanse of the great river, lingered for a moment, and sighed. It was indeed terrible. Of course, I have not experienced the horror of those days myself. What I do know was passed down to me from my elders, who had, granted, they escaped the war before the end came, so even they didn't know how and why the true devastation happened. Visit for the best novel reading experience. She paused to catch her breath, then continued in her creaky voice. The old woman nodded. Of course. It gave its carriers so many abilities. The ability to possess memories and echoes, the ability to instantly be able to enter your soul, see, awaken your aspect, be guided on the path of ascension, the nightmare spell promised people who desperately wished for power means to defend themselves. Huh. So, Weaver was not only the most insidious demon, but also a devious salesman. The nightmare spell was packed with all kinds of boons that desperate people would find irresistible, boons that the humans of the waking world took for granted, since they had nothing to compare them to. No wonder the spell spread like a plague despite the contemptible reputation of its creator. So, what happened then? Ananke lingered for a moment. The priests of the nightmare spell helped it spread, trying their best to bestow its gifts on new carriers. That was when my elders entered the tomb of Ariel. We never learned what happened after we left. The war must have turned even more harrowing, somehow, and neither side emerged victorious. Instead, everyone was destroyed. Even the gods perished. She hesitated. I heard that more outsiders appeared after the voices of the gods grew silent. Maybe they brought news to the tomb of Ariel. But by then, we were already chased far upstream, so we never met them. The old woman's voice grew wistful as she said. By now, most of them must have been consumed by the defilement. My lord, perhaps you can learn more if you speak to Dusk of Fallen Grace. She is one of the Sibyls, after all. She must know more than a humble exile like me does. Chapter 1297 Where Nightmares Come From Plus, Turn Off Reset. Chapter 1297 Where Nightmares Come From. Sunny remained silent for a while, thinking. There was a lot to think about. Although Neff's eyes were closed, he could tell that she was thoughtful, as well. The history of the dream realm, which they could only guess before, was revealed in front of them with stark clarity. Of course, Ananke had not witnessed all these events herself. But the tales she relayed were passed down to her from people who actually had. No wonder. No wonder Mordred had told him that the knowledge and experience awakened brought back from their nightmares were perhaps more important than the power and abilities they gained. And that legacy clans, especially those ruled by the sovereigns, were very particular about which seeds their science challenged. Both valor and song must have accumulated a great deal of knowledge, however, that knowledge was not something just anyone could access. Even Nephites, who had been adopted into the great clan, did not seem privy to most of their secrets yet. That was only natural. After all, knowledge was the origin of power. According to Weaver. And Anvil would not trust her with power until she had proven herself. He lingered for a few moments, then looked to his right, where Ananke's mask still lay on the wooden deck. Stretching his hand, he picked it up and stared at the fearsome, demonic face. Sunny could not glimpse anything about the mask. He did not even know whether it was a memory or a simple piece of carved wood. Glancing at Ananke, he pointed to the mask and asked, "Is this a divine memory?" She remained silent for a few moments, then slowly shook her head. "No, my lord. This one is merely sacred, a lesser facsimile of the true mask of Weaver. It is a part of the ceremonial garb that we, priests and priestesses of the nightmare spell, wear, both to escape the gaze of our pursuers and to follow in the footsteps of our benefactor, the demon of fate. The more accomplished a priest was, the higher rank memory they would be bestowed." Ananke looked away with a faint smile. "My mother, whom I inherited this memory from, was one of the few who received a mask of the sacred rank, which was the highest of honors. As for divine memories of the mask of Weaver, I've never seen these holy relics. There were only ever 2 of them, entrusted personally to the first 2 who were chosen by the demon of fate, the high priest and the high priestess of the nightmare spell." Sunny studied the surface of the mask some more. After a short stretch of silence, he followed his whim and asked, "Does it have the 'where is my eye' enchantment?" He was curious if Ananke, as the priestess of the spell, could teach him how to gaze at the tapestry of fate without dying. The old woman looked at him with a surprised expression. "Where is my eye?" No, it doesn't. But, if I may be so bold as to ask, how do you know the name of that enchantment, my lord? This sacred memory of mine only possesses 2. It was only the 2 holy masks that possessed a third, and even then, very few ever learned about it." Sunny hesitated for a long time, then sighed and summoned Weaver's mask. Soon, a fearsome mask of polished black wood appeared in his left hand, identical to the one he was holding in his right. Ananke's eyes widened slightly. Updated from Warlord, is that? He nodded. Yes. Before you start assuming things, I am not a priest of the nightmare spell, nor am I a chosen of the demon of fate. It's just that I found this thing a few years ago in a godforsaken pit of a cursed city. I've been stumbling on various traces of Weaver while traveling the dream realm, so I guess I am curious about him. Or her. Or whatever Weaver was. Does she not know what a nightmare is? He lingered for a moment, then asked. Did the spell not put people through trials, way back then? Ananke touched her white hair, then shook her head. Trials? No. I've never heard of anything like that. Sunny blinked a couple of times. Now, that's new. Why would nightmares only exist in our time? That doesn't make any sense. Nephi seemed to share his thoughts. She remained silent for a moment, then suddenly leaned forward and asked. Grandmother. I have a question, then. Where exactly does the nightmare and the nightmare spell come from? Sunny blinked. What a strange question. The old woman stared at them in bewilderment. After a while, she said. That is what Weaver named it. The demon of fate must have had a reason, but it is not for us to know what that reason was. The nightmare spell, it is just what it has always been called. Sunny and Nephi glanced at each other. The spell was always very particular with its words, and Weaver must have been the same. There was no way that the grand creation of the nebulous demon had been named without much thought. But what was the meaning of that name? Neither of them knew, and Ananke didn't seem to know either. Damn Weaver. Chapter 1298 Noble Cause. T/S chapter is updated by. Sunny left the old woman alone and returned to where Nephi was resting, full of thought. He had not received all the answers he wanted from Ananke, but at the same time, he learned a lot, maybe even too much. I don't know. There was too much information, all of it fragmented, ambiguous, and confusing. Not only that, but he was not even sure that it could be trusted. In any case, many mysteries he had never hoped to solve were resolved now. Like the destruction of the Forgotten Shore, it had become collateral damage in the war between the demons and the gods. Or the identity of the nameless prisoner of the ruined cathedral, it was one of the first two apostles chosen by Weaver to tend to and spread the nightmare spell, whoever these apostles had been. Sunny even had more context for why the followers of War God had been destroying the temples of Shadow God in his first nightmare, and what Empire Oro of the Nine was a soldier of. Still, he had even more questions now. Like always. My head hurts. He was saying these words a lot in this nightmare. Sunny sighed, then looked at Nephi. What do you think? With how obsessed she was with destroying the spell, the revelations about its origin and presumed purpose had to have shaken her, and maybe even her conviction. But Nephi simply shrugged. Makes sense. He raised an eyebrow. Huh? She looked at him and remained silent for a moment. That the nightmare spell has a purpose, and that its purpose is tied somehow to the destruction of the dream realm. However, that doesn't change anything. She frowned slightly. What happened after Ananke's elders entered the tomb of Ariel and lost contact with the outside world? How did the war escalate even further? What could have happened to cause both sides to be destroyed? Neff's eyes glinted with white radiance. And what role did the spell play in the conclusion of the war? How has it grown to its current state? Sunny felt a sudden chill as he remembered the description of Bone Weave. Despised and hunted by both sides, Weaver disappeared. No one knew where Weaver went and what they did, until it was too late. With white light burning in her eyes, Nephi looked at him and asked. Did you ever think that, maybe, the nightmare spell is not only responsible for the devastation of our world, but also for the destruction of the dream realm? He remained silent for a while, his expression troubled. Then, Sunny rolled his eyes. Damn it, Neff. You do remember what flaw I have, right? Please don't subject me to avalanches of questions like that. To answer all of them. I don't know, I have no idea, I have no clue, there's no way to tell. Nephi's blinked a couple of times, then opened her eyes wide and covered her mouth with a hand. Oh. Sorry. Sunny continued nonchalantly. That is a mystery to me, who knows? And yes, I did consider it before. There, all done. In the awkward silence that followed, he smiled and said. Anyway. All this talking made me hungry. Let's eat. Sunny felt spoiled eating Ananke's home-cooked food, so much so that the weight he had lost on the dark island was slowly returning. The old woman herself still ate like a bird, but she seemed to be in a better state than before. Her hands were shaking less, and she remained lucid for longer periods of time before having to rest. The Ketch continued to move downstream, devouring distance with great speed. Nothing had attacked them yet, perhaps because they had left the most dangerous region of the Great River, perhaps because Ananke knew how to navigate the flowing waters to avoid danger. It was probably both. The day came to an end, followed by a peaceful night. Sunny spent most of that time quietly working on mastering the fourth step of Shadow Dance. The dire enlightenment he had gained in the battle against the Azure Serpent was steadily leading him to success. In the morning, they enjoyed a scrumptious breakfast, and then, nothing changed. The journey continued, and the waters of the great river remained the same. The old Ketch continued to travel into the past. Chapter 1299 Nameless Things. A few more days passed in blissful idleness. Sunny continued concentrating on Shadow Dance, not ready yet to learn more from Ananke. The information she had shared with them was already vexing enough, and he was struggling to parse through all of its many implications. He also resumed his habit of studying the weave of the estuary key, even though it still remained a complete mystery to him. After hesitating for a while, Sunny turned to the old woman for help, but there was no result. Although she was a priestess of the nightmare spell and a follower of the demon of fate, she was not a weaver herself. Sunny knew more about weaver sorcery than Ananke did. Which was not to say that she did not know anything about sorcery at all. After spending several days in the Ketch, Sunny and Nephi noticed two strange things about the swift vessel and its owner. The first one concerned the Ketch itself. Its sails were always full of wind, pushing the boat across the shining surface of the great river with enviable speed. Which was not too strange in and of itself, if not for the fact that this speed was too constant and stable. It also did not seem as though the direction and strength of the wind ever changed, or rather, they never changed around the Ketch. They did, however, change some distance away from it, creating an eerie situation where the waters where the wooden sailboat passed were different from the rest of the world. Not only that, but Ananke also never manipulated the sails in any way to help them catch the wind. And nothing ever attacked them. Both Sunny and Nephi knew, of course, that the Ketch was not a mundane boat. It was obviously enchanted in some way, they just did not know how. There were no runes carved into its surface and no sophisticated runic patterns like on the chain breaker. There was no spell weave hidden within the old wood either. Updated from. Eventually, they were defeated by curiosity and asked Ananke directly. That was how Sunny learned that, while the old woman was not a weaver, she was still a sorceress. However, the sorcery she used did not belong to the demon of fate, nor was it the runic sorcery created by Hope. Instead, it was the ancient sorcery upon which Hope's runic magic was based, the sorcery of names. Noticing their bewilderment, the old woman chuckled. My lord and lady, don't look too surprised. I am not some kind of powerful shaper. I was just taught a few simple names and phrases by my mother, enough to sail the great river and provide for myself. Sunny and Nephi were still stunned. It was not every day that they met a practitioner of an entirely new system of sorcery. In fact, Sunny had only ever met two sorcerers, himself and Noctis. Noctis had known a great deal about true names of things and how to invoke them, but his was a more sophisticated kind of magic, which relied on inscribing the names with runes instead of speaking them directly. Nephi had met a few more, considering that she was acquainted with the forge masters of Clan Valor. She had told him that the members of the Valor family often received aspects tied to crafting, which was how they were able to create powerful memories. However, the family had accumulated plenty of knowledge of runic sorcery, as well. The cage that Sunny and Cassie had almost died in during their imprisonment in the Night Temple was proof. Plus, if Nephi's learned these names from Ananke, he could always ask her to teach him in the future. Sunny sighed, then forced himself to say, "I'll decline, for now." His heart was in pain. Nephi looked at him silently, then turned to Ananke and bowed slightly. "Please teach me, grandmother." The old woman nodded with satisfaction. "It will be an honor, my lady." And that was how the first strange thing they noticed was resolved. The second, though. The second had to do with Ananke herself. It seemed that the further downstream they traveled, the more the old woman changed. Chapter 1300 Riverborn. When Sunny and Nephi first met Ananke, both were concerned about the frail old woman. She just looked too ancient and weak, ready to snap like a twig. Her tan skin was thin and transparent like oil paper, her cloudy eyes teary and dull, her gaunt figure so small that it seemed to be drowning in the black folds of her dark mantle. They were not sure that the old woman could survive another peaceful day, let alone a long and perilous journey across the great river. However, as the days went by, their worries were proven wrong. Old Ananke continued to cling to life. In fact, her condition seemed to be improving little by little. She had more energy now, could remain fully lucid for longer periods of time, and even regained some of her appetite. At first, Sunny thought that it was simply the result of finally having hope again after waiting for the two of them for gods knew how long, as well as eating better. But as more time passed, the difference became too obvious to be explained by mere inspiration. Ananke was definitely changing. Her hands gradually stopped shaking, and her grip on the steering oar became firmer. Her cloudy eyes regained some of their former sharpness. She wasn't hunching as much anymore, and her voice was not as weak and creaky as before. She did not grow tired as quickly as she had at the start, and the long periods of silence where she seemed to doze off with her eyes open happened less and less frequently, until ceasing altogether. It was as though Ananke was slowly growing younger. Sunny had to admit that he was not just imagining things when he opened his eyes one day to notice that there were suddenly a few black strands in her long, snow-white hair. "What is going on?" He looked at Ananke for a few moments, then lowered his gaze to the powerful current of the great river, which flowed into the past. Nephi, who had been practicing the names the old woman taught her, to no result, for now noticed that he was awake and carefully pulled on the sleeve of his tunic. Then, she silently glanced at Ananke and back. Sunny hesitated for a moment. "Me? Why do I have to ask?" Asking a woman about her age, does she think I like courting death? Well, to be honest, his track record indeed suggested that he did. He sighed, threw an indignant glance at Nephi, and approached the old woman while secretly studying her face and thin frame. There was no denying it, Ananke looked much more hale than she had before. She could not be called young by any means, still, but neither could she be called decrepit or ancient. Sunny lingered for a second or two, then asked politely, "Grandmother, can I ask you something?" The old woman smiled at him kindly. "Of course, my lord. Now what am I supposed to say?" Sunny took a deep breath, then just came clean with it. "It might sound weird, but, are you, by any chance, getting younger?" Ananke looked at him with a startled expression. Sunny coughed in embarrassment. "I'm sorry, it's just that. I noticed that you look better. I don't mean that you didn't look well before." The old woman suddenly chuckled. No. It is me who needs to apologize, my lord. I just have never met someone entirely from outside the tomb of Ariel before. That is why it is not easy for me to account for the fact that you might not know some things that are common sense here." She shook her head, and then said gently, "Yes, this body of mine is indeed getting younger. It is because we are moving downstream." Sunny and Nephi looked at each other, perplexed. After a few moments of silence, he furtively studied her slender figure, while she openly studied his. Eventually, Nephi said, "But, it doesn't seem like Sunny and I changed?" Wouldn't they have become toddlers by now? Ananke nodded, her expression slightly sad. Sar the novel fire. Any *T website on Google to access chapters of novels early and in the highest quality. Of course not. It is because you are outsiders, while I am Riverborn. The outsiders are not beholden to the flow of the great river, since they have come from outside it. They are free to roam it as they wish, traveling any distance. That is why they are also called pilgrims. She smiled. But we, Riverborn, are different. Since we were born inside the tomb of Ariel, we are beholden to the flow of time within it. We can only travel as far as our lifespans allow, and even then, the only direction that is allowed to us is upstream. We are chained to the stretch of the great river where we come from. Sunny looked at her in bewilderment, struggling to imagine what such a life would look like. Wait, how does it even work? At the same time, Nephis asked. So, you grow older when you move upstream, and grow younger when you move downstream? That is, in relation to the place where you were born? Ananke looked between the two of them helplessly, then finally decided to answer Nef's question first and nodded. Indeed. Sunny blinked a couple of times, then suddenly opened his eyes wide. Wait, does that mean that as long as you stay in place, you are immortal? Ananke sighed softly. Our bodies will not age, my lord. That is not the same as being immortal. She looked at the sparkling expanse of the great river wistfully. Actually, we Riverborn don't usually live that long. At least not in Weave. Life here is full of hardship, and the waters are dangerous. Since we live close to the desolate future, there are many corrupted coming from upstream, all of them immune to the flow of time. Things were fine when we had many outsiders among us, our elders, but as their number dwindled, it grew harder and harder to provide for ourselves and defend the city. The old woman's face grew dark. After all, it is not easy to fight an enemy that can attack and retreat freely while you lack the ability to pursue it. Still, we managed. Life in Weave might not have been easy or opulent, but it was blissful. At least mine was. Ananke fell silent, a faint smile on her lips. Now wait a minute. Sunny tilted his head and, unable to control himself, blurted out. Then, grandmother, no, Ananke, how old are you, really? Ah. What am I doing? The old woman looked at him and chuckled. Me? Actually, among the river people, I am considered to be quite a young woman. He froze. Nephis froze, too. Why young? Ananke nodded earnestly. Of course. I am barely 200 years old.